Willy Inmon is a 21-year-old who liked to practice shooting on his down-at-heel family ranch deep in the Arizona countryside. Recently claiming to be back from serving as a soldier in Iraq, he was on edge when police called by.
They start pounding on the door, and with me being so jumpy from the service, they're lucky I didn't come to the door with my gun.
You like guns?
Yes, I do.
What kind do you have?
I've got a Walther P22, I got a M14, I've got 3 shotguns.
Willy's friend, Ricky Flores, 16, missing from home. He'd gone AWOL before, but had promised to mend his ways.
It didn't make sense that he was gone and he wasn't coming home. So that was the first clue that something wasn't right.
A lot didn't add up for local detectives in this remote part of Apache County.
We both had the same feeling that Ricky was hurt or that he was dead.
I knew it wasn't good. He didn't hang out with the best crowd of people.
Nick Flores' brother Ricky hung out with Willy Inmon, the guy with the hurt trigger. One day, Inmon walked into a police station and started talking. Did detectives have a killer in custody? And was he responsible for the murder of 2 other men?
I didn't suspect any foul play or anything. There was a little bit of blood that was outside of his mouth and some blood pooled up in his left ear. We know that, if you've done something bad, the worst thing in the world is for you to have to carry it the rest of your life.
The rules of engagement were in place. Cop seeking the truth, killer a skilled liar.
If I was to do such atrocity, I could be out there getting rid of it and you would never know.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Willy Inmon as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Apache County, an area of ranches and small communities, like St. John's. Population 3,200.
It's a small town. There's not a lot of people. Everybody knows everybody. It's a good place to live if you don't like a lot of company. But unfortunately, bad things happen everywhere, and just happened to be to my family here in St. John's, Arizona.
Ricky Flores, Nick's brother, was murdered.
His head was blown off with a 12-gauge shotgun.
Ricky had last been seen alive with this man, Willy Inmon. He lived on a ranch just outside St. John's. Willy's girlfriend, Stormy, lived in Springerville, 29 miles away. Different police jurisdiction. Something which would loom large in the story of William Inmon. Willy walked into Springerville Station on a hot August morning just 5 weeks after his buddy Ricky was first reported missing. When he got there, he insisted on seeing the chief of police himself, Steve West.
I sat down with Mr. Inman and we started talking, just general talk.
Chief West knew nothing about the missing Ricky Flores. Why would he? Flores was a St. John's matter. This was Springerville.
Like a lot of communities, we still have crime, we just don't have as much of it. Children still walk, to the stores. They still go to the movie theater by themselves.
Chief West was as in the dark as anyone about Ricky Flores as he sat opposite Willy Inmon. During a 9-hour interview session which followed, there would be many revelations. As well as a love for guns, Willy Inmon shared views with Nazis. He showed his fascination by donning Nazi insignias on his baseball cap.
Wow.
My grandpa was the greatest Luftwaffe pilot any pilot ever existed. only one to receive over 1,200 kills.
Willy had a deep sense of what he believed was wrong, was right, was bad or good, and he wanted to rid the world of what he saw as undesirables.
I try to be as law-abiding as possible.
The first time that I knew about the case was when we got a press release about the disappearance of Ricky Flores.
Karen Warnick is the local reporter who covered the story of Ricky's disappearance.
We've had other missing people in the area occasionally, and at the time it didn't really strike a chord. It was just another juvenile disappearance.
My brother went missing in August of 2009. No one really knew what was happening or what was going on. No one in my family knew.
What was confusing to the Flores family about Ricky's disappearance was that he had turned over a new leaf. He'd been something of a wild child until recently.
My brother just got out of juvenile, and instead of staying in there longer, he decided to take 1 year probation for some minor drug charges and stuff. And he was working on himself and his life. He was starting to realize that he couldn't just keep f***ing off. And he was really trying to work on himself, and he was a good person.
St. John's detective Lucas Rodriguez knew all about Ricky and liked him, despite his adolescent ways.
Ricky Flores, good kid, a little bit rebellious. He has been in trouble. Mostly, I would say a lot of it, mostly the only juveniles can get in trouble with. Curfews, smoking, and maybe a little drinking. He has done a little bit of drugs. Some fighting with his mom, and by fighting, I don't mean punches. I mean verbally, and not wanting to listen to mom and stuff, like wanting to be his own man and stuff like that.
And he decided that, you know, enough was enough, and told my mom that he wanted counseling and he wanted to just do some programs to help him through it. I mean, he's a young kid. He doesn't know what's going on, and he's just trying to have fun.
How would Officer Rodriguez sum up the character of Ricky Flores around that time?
Ricky does have a good heart. He does care about his mom, does care about his brothers and family and stuff like that. He just likes to do his own thing and doesn't want people to tell him, but he is in the process of changing his life, changing his, he just has a new kid. Now he knows he has to be responsible and change his ways. It's not just about him anymore.
What had changed Ricky for the better was fatherhood.
He wanted to do good, and he wanted to take care of his newborn baby.
Ricky, Hispanic, had a white girlfriend called Jessica Johnson, now the mother of his child. They all knew Ricky was behaving himself, so why would he suddenly disappear?
I was called by dispatch and asking me to meet Maura Flores. She had reported him missing for, it had been a week now, and still had not heard back from anybody, and still had not heard from Ricky.
Ricky, she said, never left without his phone charger and always checked in, even on bender days when he'd get high. But not this time.
So it didn't make sense that he was gone and he wasn't coming home. So that was the first clue that something wasn't right. Well, I knew it wasn't good. He didn't hang out with the best crowd of people.
People like Willy Inmon.
William Inmon was just another person that hung around my house. He was friends with my brother. My mom fed him. She gave him food. She gave him clothes if he needed them.
Willy referred to Maura as mom. So, hey, mom, I'm taking Ricky out to the ranch. We're gonna shoot or something, go shooting or something like that. And Ricky said, hey, mom, I'll be back in a little while. Well, Ricky and said, yeah, no problem, son. And saw them jump in the Jeep and take off.
And she waved goodbye to Ricky with Inman by his side. They went to Willy's ranch, met up with his girlfriend, Stormy Williams.
She said that was the last time she saw Ricky and heard from Ricky.
Willy Inmon picked up Ricky Flores, and they were friends. And he took them out to his property out east of St. John's.
Officer Rodriguez brought Willy into St. John's police station for questioning. "Where is Ricky?" he asked.
Willy told me that indeed Ricky was at the ranch with him, and that they had gone, he talked to him about drugs and to stay away from drugs and stuff like that.
It was to be a recurring theme in the interrogation of Willy Inmon. He was a good guy, helping out a teenage kid with good advice during target practice. Willy had no idea where Ricky was. But detectives didn't believe him. And Ricky's brother Nick was not hopeful either.
He liked to party and he liked to get in trouble. He hung out with older people. So I figured it wasn't anything too good why he was missing.
Detectives in St. John's did not believe Willy Inmon's story and suspected him in a murder of Ricky Flores. Now, could they get him to admit it?
If there was an accident, something went wrong, if self-defense, whatever the reason was, I'm going to give you one chance, one time, sitting here in front of the chief, to tell me why it happened.
Over the days and weeks following the disappearance of Ricky Flores, Officer Lucas Rodriguez was to meet with Willy Inmon often. He'd ask the same question.
I mean, Willy, come on, tell me where Ricky is. As the interview progressed, I can see a lot of deception signs on Willy. His carotid artery, I've never seen, but his carotid artery was literally bouncing. He started sweating, he started getting hot. He didn't fidgeting, he actually took his shirt off saying it was too hot in there. I was in uniform and it was not hot. I had a vest on and I was comfortable. I just could not get him to tell me what had happened to Ricky. I asked him, I remember asking him if I was gonna find Ricky alive. And Willy said he hoped so.
It was soon after one such interview that Inmon left St. John's police station. He headed over to Springerville to meet up with his girlfriend, Stormy, 18 years older, with educational difficulties. Detective Rodriguez wasn't giving up easily and called on the couple there, along with a colleague, Deputy Morales. Still no answers.
We thank Willy and Stormy for talking to us, told them we'll get back in touch with us because we were looking for Ricky. And they said, yeah, no problem. Deputy Morales and I left, and on our way back into town, me and him were talking. We both had the same feeling that Ricky was hurt or that he was dead.
As for Willy, he'd grown tired of Lucas Rodriguez and the St. John's Police Department. He headed to the Chief of Police, Steve West, over at Springerville. "Help me out, Chief. Get these guys off my back."
What St. John's PD is asking you is they're asking you if you know the whereabouts of Ricky.
Correct.
And what's Ricky's last name?
Flores.
Flores. Okay, so they're asking you if you know the whereabouts of Ricky Flores. They're saying what? That you were the last one to see him?
Correct.
Right.
And that I know something, and they keep pressuring me like I do know something, which if I didn't, I would tell them because I want them off my back. So I'm tired of being harassed. They have no right coming to my girl's house, no right whatsoever. And last time they came here without a sheriff escort. They came in their St. John's police car out of jurisdiction. And they've broken the law. They searched her next door neighbor's house, and which...
This is Stormy's next door neighbor's house?
Yeah, correct. Which they had no right being in his yard.
Willy Inmon had made a big mistake. He believed one of the police forces in Apache County would not support another in a missing person inquiry which was increasingly feeling like a murder investigation.
Normally it's for a chief of police not to get involved in a case is kind of rare, but since he had already struck a rapport with Willy, we allowed Steve to continue talking to Willy.
Still, no one knew where Ricky Flores was. But if he had been murdered by Inmon, investigators needed to find a body, establish motive and method. That last part would prove straightforward. Inmon was a trained gunman whose best friends were the guns that he fired out on his ranch.
When you were in the military, were you ever dispatched overseas?
Yes, sir.
Oh, is that right? Where did you fight?
Iraq.
Oh, did you?
Yes, sir.
Where was the first place you were deployed over there?
First place was Fallujah.
Uh-huh.
And then from there we moved downwards, and then it was the sniper alley I mainly was on, which was a 6-mile stretch between the Green Zone and Baghdad Airport.
Steve West was employing a softly approach and was getting results. Inmon had almost certainly revealed how he had killed Ricky Flores, by shooting him. But if he had, what was his motive?
It was really strange because Mr. Inmon, he had this affinity, number one, as far as being calm, to why he was there. He didn't seem upset about that at all. But the other thing was he had this affinity to talk about Nazism. And the way he did that is he did the Nazism, and the way it come out was on his baseball cap, he had some Nazi insignias, some little medals on there.
Inmon, who cherished his German heritage, claimed that his grandfather was a crack Luftwaffe pilot who'd fought a just war.
The final solution. And seriously, I totally understand going after the Jews for bankrupting our country and trying to steal the world and everything they do and believe in, and we needed our money back.
And as Chief West sweet-talked Willy, Officer Rodriguez was listening to a different story. He'd asked Willy's girlfriend Stormy to call by Springerville police station. Her arrival was the turning point in the investigation. She'd been with Willy when he had returned to his ranch with Ricky.
It was decided to tell Stormy that Willy had confessed to the homicide. Stormy actually started talking and said yes, they had killed Ricky, and went into detail on how they had killed him and how they had taken him back to town and how they had buried him.
Until the moment that Inmon entered Springerfield Station, he had revealed no mistakes in the murder of Ricky Flores. Now he was regretting ever asking Chief West for protection from those St. John's cops who'd stepped out of line. It had resulted in his girlfriend giving them both away. What had happened down on the ranch?
Just tell us what happened, Willy. That's the biggest thing. Run us through it.
Oh my God.
Well, I mean, stuff happens. We know that.
Yes, and I'm telling you, I did not want to kill the kid. It was not murder, I can tell you that much.
Okay.
Oh God, I can't believe this.
Just tell us
Well,
what
that's
was
okay.
it.
Yeah, just tell us the story.
Inmon claimed that he and Ricky had got into an argument whilst at target practice on Inman's ranch. But Ricky had fired first.
This ended up as self-defense. Something happened.
We finally got him to admit that he indeed did shoot this kid. Now, the way he said he shot him was this. He said they were both out at the site east of St. John's, and that they were out there and they were target practicing. And they started shooting cans and whatnot, and Ricky wanted to shoot the rifle, and so he let him shoot the rifle, and Mr. Inmon said that he was standing by his car and a bullet hit the window next to him. He said that he took that as an aggressive move, and he got his rifle and started firing at Ricky.
He shot at me, I shot back.
Willy did disclose that the homicide had actually occurred at his ranch. I believe he shot him in the head.
I had a single gauge shotgun, and he had my M14, and he took a shot at me, and I shot him.
As the real-life drama unfolded, it seemed the case was closed.
Of course, by then he was in tears. You know, he was acting semi-remorseful. And the way that we got that interview out of him was basically saying, hey, you know, people do bad things, you know, please, you know, we know that, you know, if you've done something bad, the worst thing in the world is for you to have to carry it the rest of your life. You know, you need to come clean on that so that your conscience will be clear. And we went on and on and on, and finally that's when he admitted that.
God, I can't believe this. I'm gonna go away from murder. I just fucking do it.
Willie, you need to settle down. We need to get all the facts so that we can determine what's happened here. Okay? We need you to stay together for us. We're not your enemies.
Please, I need some tobacco, please. My God, I can't believe this.
At first, Willie stuck to his self-defense story, but was he telling the truth? Was this really a case of self-defense? Ricky's girlfriend, Jessica Johnson, had a father who did not like Hispanic boys. Like Ricky Flores.
I believe at one point Mr. Johnson and Melissa Johnson, the mom of Jessica Johnson, got a restraining order against Ricky and not allowed him to come around and be around Jessica. Well, it didn't matter because Jessica loved Ricky and she would sneak out of the house as well and go meet with him and vice versa. And Jessica had just recently given birth to a child, which belonged to Ricky.
It was even rumored that Jeff Johnson, Jessica's dad, was connected to a white supremacist group, one that Willie was all too afraid of.
I'm dead either way. As he goes down, there's too many out there. They are too smart. They will find me. They will kill me.
What other damaging evidence which might implicate others would emerge from the interview room? Was Willy Inmon a hired gun working for a racist? Throughout Texas and Arizona, a neo-Nazi group called the Aryan Brotherhood has been carrying out drugs and gun-running crimes for decades. Exclusively white, its so-called captains exert a violent influence over its members. Fraternization with non-whites is forbidden. Detectives throughout the Apache County area suspected Jeffrey Johnson, father of Ricky Flores' girlfriend, of involvement with the Brotherhood. Police now had a theory which would blow Inman's self-defense claims out of the water.
It would not look good to Mr. Johnson that, since he's a white supremacist, that his daughter had a kid from a Hispanic kid. And did not want, he wanted Ricky gone and had offered to pay money for that.
Had Jeffrey Johnson ordered a hit on the boyfriend of his daughter? Another detective entered the room.
I understand the white supremacist swastikas. I know every tattoo on the guy's body. I know all about this guy right now. I've known about him for a long time. Quit taking care of him and take care of yourself. He knew you were going to murder him, and he was supposed to pay you. I know that. Tell me the truth, please.
Willie was not about to give evidence against Jeff Johnson in a murder crime.
Listen, he wanted me to beat his ass. Yes, he didn't want no death, no killing. And I thought about it, but no.
These were the facts established. After the murder of Ricky, Inman and Stormy Williams drove at speed from his ranch into St. John's and headed straight for Jeffrey Johnson's house.
He drove his body through the town of St. John's to Jeffrey Johnson's house.
The whole reason for Willie bringing the body over into town in the beginning, of just instead of just going through the back roads and going away from town, was that he came over and showed proof to Mr. Johnson that he had actually taken care of the job and killed Ricky.
My niece was probably sitting there, you know, just a couple months old, and, you know, her dad's body is in the back of a Suzuki Samurai, and her biological grandfather is going out there to look at it.
Why did you take the body to Jeff's house?
Because I was scared. I wanted to know.
Tell me exactly what you told Jeff when you got to his house.
I told Jeff, dude, he's in my car. You want to come look? Dude, I need some help. What the hell am I going to do? His words were exactly, get the f*** out of here and I don't want to see you again. That was his words.
William said that Mr. Johnson gave him got mad at him for bringing the body, and that got $20 from him for gas, and that was all, and he took off.
Had Jeffrey Johnson made a flippant, angry comment about wishing Ricky dead, and Willy taken it at face value, Inmon left, drove up to the Elk Ranch, found a deserted spot, dug a shallow grave, and set Ricky's body alight. Storm E. Williams told detectives enough for them to find it.
Well, his body was burned so bad and his head was blown off with a 12-gauge shotgun. So there wasn't too much to be looking at. So they had to identify him by a homemade tattoo he had on his ankle, and he also had broken his arm pretty severely and got some pins and plates in it. So that's how they identified his body, because there wasn't too much to say that this person was who he was.
Inmon repeatedly refused to say that the murder was anything to do with Jeff Johnson.
Why are you so afraid of Jeff? What do you know about him that scares you so bad, Willie?
I know the Aryan Brotherhood. There's too many out there. He gets one message through to anybody. I will be dead. That's guaranteed. I know how they roll. He goes down, I will go down.
So you're covering, you don't have to admit to it, but you are covering his ass because you're afraid of death. Tell me that much.
I'm afraid of death, period.
Willy did not testify in court that he had acted on the instructions of anyone. Jeff Johnson and his wife Melissa would stand trial for hindering the prosecution in the case of the murder of Ricky Flores.
I think his charges were correct because he had knowledge and he did nothing to try to slow that down. But also I think that by sheer virtue of it taking place, I think that was a shock to him also.
Jeff Johnson was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Melissa Johnson was given probation. As for Willy's girlfriend, Storm E. Williams, she had been with Willy when he killed Ricky, had helped him move the body. But the mental well-being issues that she faced meant that she would never be charged.
Wasn't a person who could think on her own. That she would make a decision to do something, and if she felt like it, made Willy happy, or Willy wanted her to do it, she'd do it. She wasn't a crazy person. She was just really gullible and would do anything to make William Inmon happy.
So that appeared to be the full story of what had happened out on Inman's ranch and later in St. John's and Elk Ranch. A teenager shot, his body paraded in front of his child's grandfather before being burned and partially buried. Willy even drew for detectives where the partial burial took place. But that was far from the end of the William Inmon murder story. Detectives were still unable to find the gun that he had used to kill Ricky.
He asked him about the gun, what happened to it. He had indicated that he had thrown it in the sewer pond over in St. John's.
Not having the murder weapon felt like a loose end. Perhaps it had been used in other crimes. In St. John's County, there had been a suspicious death 2 years earlier, and another person had gone missing that same year. The suspicious death was of William McGarriger, known as Stoney, a 72-year-old who'd been found dead in his trailer in 2007. Did Inmon know anything?
There's another case we want to talk to you about. The clock is running. If you can help us on that murder.
I have no idea on that at all. I do not. Me.
Stoney was murdered, and that was quite some time ago. How'd you hear about it?
First, I was laying down and I got a phone call. And my dad told me. That's how I first found out.
6 hours after Willy Inmon had asked Chief West for help, he had confessed to killing Ricky Flores. Now he was a suspect in another murder. But how would detectives get the evidence for that crime if indeed he was guilty?
God, I can't believe this. I'm gonna go away from murder. I just fucking do it.
else had happened in the William Inmon story. Stoney McGarrigle was a loner who lived out in the woods near St. John's. His ranch was right next door to Ricky's. Real estate salesman Louis Leroux helped buy the property for him.
Stoney, I met him when he first came up to St. John's. He was a character, and he didn't trust a whole lot of people. And if you betrayed his trust, then, oh, all hell broke loose. And if you made him mad, he'd get in your face, he'd go nose to nose with you, and he'd scream at you, and make, oh gosh, he was dramatic, but he was a character. And he was a caring type of character once you were in his inner circle.
Unpopular with many, Stoney McGarrigle had faced some difficult times. He'd lost his wife and a young son in a tragic accident. As a result, he was depressed and an alcoholic by 2007. He mentioned suicide to his friend Louis on numerous occasions, said he was drinking himself to death.
He would not touch a $50 bill, because when he lost his wife and his 2 sons many years earlier, he had been hoarding money, and all he had was $50 bills. And so that freaked him out. He wouldn't accept it for payment. He wouldn't carry it.
Stoney, mistrusting of the bank, hoarded money in his home. People, including William Inmon, knew all about that. One day in 2007, Louis Leroux was to be plunged into a drama all of his own.
I had been out of town during that day. I'd been up in Pine Top, and a couple people had contacted me and say, hey, we've been needing to get a hold of Stoney. He's not responding. He's not getting back with us. We're concerned about him.
Louis headed out to the ranch.
So I went in there and I found him. He was laying on his right side like he always slept, with his arm up above the blanket. And then when I got over to him, he was kind of gray color and cold and stiff. Realized he was dead. Not expecting anybody to be murdered. Nobody had been murdered in St. John's in decades and decades.
The real estate salesman was in for a shock.
Stoney McGarrigle was shot in his bed while he was sleeping.
He had been murdered and been shot, and the homicide had gone unsolved since 2007.
Detectives knew Inmon was a neighbor of McGarrigle. When still talking after the Flores revelations, one officer threw out a question.
Back to the Stoney deal. No, you don't know anything about that?
No, sir.
Help yourself out.
No, sir,
No knowledge of that murder at all.
A reward had been offered for information about the death of Stoney. Willie knew all about it. He would certainly have cooperated if he could.
If I did, I'd be collecting the money. Me and my brother did, and...
What'd you say, you and your brother?
Me and my brother were trying to figure out who did, because we wanted the money, because we were hurting bad at that time.
Right.
With a population of just 3,200, St. John's had 2 murders on its hands, and only 1 solved.
St. John's, you never expected anything like that. It's just a nice little community. When the phrase is St. John's is a town of friendly neighbors, and that's pretty well what it is. To have something like that happen is shocking.
Investigators had come up with nothing over the 2 years since the murder of Stoney McGarrigle, but for now they asked no more of Willy Inmon. Soon, at a case review, Willy Inmon's name came up in relation to an old motoring offence, and another mystery was born.
Willie had been stopped in a Camaro, a really nice Camaro. No plates, and the car had been impounded. But the car was, I believe the car was still impounded. Nobody had taken it out. That had been months prior to this, prior to Ricky being missing. And we started coming to a conclusion as to, okay, where's the owner for stuff like that.
One officer remembered the vehicle, gave a report.
I used to see this guy, and I think his name is Daniel. He used to drive it all the time, and I haven't seen him in a while.
Daniel Acton, a Vietnam War veteran and another whose ranch was adjacent to Willy Inmon's.
I knew that he had not been around, and people were asking about him and things. I hadn't seen him, but Daniel was a real nice guy.
Who nobody had seen for a while. Police wanted answers to the mysteries out in Apache County.
Well, need to still get Stoney, and you still guys have a missing person, that the car is still an impound, and that needs to be solved, and we need to find out where the person is that they were driving the car. I told him, well, that's where you gotta go, and that's kind of where this needs to be.
2 dead men, 1 confession, and a missing man. And they all had one thing in common. They lived on or next to the ranch of William Nicholas Inmon. They'd got a confession once. What would it take for detectives to get the truth out of Willy Inmon a second time? And was there actually a link between the 3 deaths?
I don't think it was connected. I don't think in the beginning the disappearance of Ricky and the disappearance of Daniel, or the death of Stoney, the murder of Stoney, was related.
And if Willy Inmon was in custody not suspected of the murder of Stoney, that left just one conclusion.
We have a killer loose in the community.
Was Daniel Acton a victim of murder? He was missing and his car was in a police pound, having last been driven by William Inmon. Acton was not the grumpy old guy that the murdered Stoney McGarrigle was. Unlike him, Acton had no enemies.
I knew Daniel as best as anybody did. Daniel was, I'm hard of hearing. Daniel was totally deaf. Once in a while he'd hear a word, but he read lips.
It wouldn't take long for Willy to confess, now that he'd started. Throughout the interview with Chief Steve West, Willy seemed eager to please. He was a good guy. He'd wanted to help Ricky, the kid just wouldn't listen. That was Willy's story. Corporal Inmon was a former army man. He could be trusted.
He did give up his rights to an attorney in order for us to talk to him the second time. And it was almost like something you'd see in prison, in the fact that he was willing to give up information for stuff on the second interview. If we got him cigarettes, he would talk to us. If we got him a hamburger, he would talk to us. So during that discussion, it was like, well, yeah, lunchtime's coming up, we'll get you a hamburger, we'll talk to you about it, yada, 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 and he did.
Willy had admitted that he had murdered Ricky Flores. He'd had good reason. The kid was fooling around with drugs. During the second interrogation, Inmon decided to trade. He'd agreed to the interview in exchange for a hamburger. Now he was going to up the stakes. He traded the truth for his life. If the police did not seek the death penalty, he would tell all. A deal was struck. Willy would not face execution in exchange for a full confession. He admitted finally that he had killed Stoney McGarrigle. After shooting Stoney 12 times through his window, Willy ransacked the house, stole some of the money that McGarrigle kept hidden. But there was something else that Willy claimed. Stoney had inappropriately touched Inmon once. He was probably a child molester.
And he actually said that they deserved to die.
And he took officers out into the deepest part of the Elk Ranch to show where he had buried the body of Danny Acton. His crime? The deaf man couldn't hear what Willy could each evening.
Yeah, Daniel, the main reason that he wanted to do something about that was because of his barking dog. Yeah, he couldn't get the barking dog shut up.
Willy ended up taking us. I remember going with Willy. He agreed that it was okay for me to go and follow him as he took us to the ranch where he had killed Ricky. He took us to the place where Daniel Ekman had been killed, and then he took us to where Stoney had been killed and how he killed Stoney.
Inmon, the former military man, the gun nut, had been seeking police protection, but had ended up bringing a naive accomplice in front of persuasive police detectives, and then admitted 3 murders. Murders that he felt he was justified in committing.
He wanted to rid the world of people who he felt shouldn't be in this world. So he had a grievance against those men, so he took it upon himself to be the one to get rid of them, to make the world better.
Indeed, he styled himself as a vigilante.
He was branded a serial killer, a vigilante killer, the youngest serial killer in the country.
He did this with malice. He knew where he was going, he knew what he was doing, he knew how he was going to do it. He planned it, staged it, and completed it. So if that isn't vigilantism, nothing is. And he's doing it for a cause that he thinks is right. Whether it was barking dogs, whether it was because they're a dope slinger, or whether they were a child molester or whatever. He always had this reason in the back of his mind for doing that.
Once he started talking, Willy Inmon couldn't stop. He'd wanted to avoid detection as a killer, but made the mistake of surrendering himself in the belief that he was too clever to be caught out.
Willy, when he talks to you, when you talk to him, he can be looking at you, but you can feel like he's looking into your soul, kind of like a scary type of demeanor that Willy has. He never showed remorse, never. I think he would just do it again. He was nonchalant about the whole thing and how he went around and almost with a smile on how he killed him and what he did and how he covered his tracks and stuff like that. It's like in any other day, it's just like you tell me how your day was and how it was at work.
There has been controversy about Inman's sentence. Some expected the death sentence, others life without parole. In the event, he was given 24 years for all 3 murders, to be served without parole.
He's suffering in prison, and he's living with what he did all the rest of his days that he's there. I think what's going to be the most interesting is what happens when he gets out. So what happens then? And that would be the story to cover, to find out, 1, has he changed? Is he the same man? Of course, he was 21, so is he different? Is he going to do the same thing? Is he going to come back up into this community and live? I think all of that would be very interesting.
Stoney McGarrigle and Daniel Acton did not deserve to be killed by William Inmon, but at least they'd lived a full life. Ricky Flores was a minor, a child in the eyes of the law whose life was taken by a man who considered himself to have just cause.
There's some messed up part in his head that, said, if I can kill these people and, people can't figure out about it, then I'm obviously doing something right. I'm taking bad people off the street. That's what he claimed his thought process was. But really, he was just a skinny, frail boy who lived out east of St. John's, Arizona, that everyone, just knew as the skinny, poor boy, that it's kind of hard to make your name for yourself when you start there. And he just wanted to show that he had some sort of power. He wasn't worthless. He could make these kind of bad things happen. He thought that he would be remembered as, a mastermind of some sort, but really he was just some dumbass that, wanted to take people's relatives away from them.
William Nicholas Inmon will be released from prison in 2035. On a cold, dark London evening, a man hauls a heavy bag into the back of a cab. Hours later, he discards it in a canal. It's been a struggle, despite his best efforts, to lighten the load.
A human body, is a very unwieldy, heavy, difficult object. And if you can cut it down into pieces, they become more manageable.
The next day, a 29-year-old star of BBC soap series EastEnders is reported missing. At first, few fear the worst.
People go missing all the time, and we have to remember that adults are entitled to go missing if they want to.
Sometime later, a shocking sight confronts a group using a canal for leisure boating.
Gemma's skull was found about half a mile upstream of where her torso had been recovered. And they identified this plastic bag and opened it up, and to their horror, there was this head, her skull inside.
Murdered, her body had been dismembered and thrown into the water. Who had killed Gemma McCluskie, and what part had her brother Tony played in her disappearance and death?
Tony and Gemma are known to have a difficult relationship. Gemma's told friends that he can be controlling, he can be abusive. She's told her father that he can be aggressive and abusive.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Tony McCluskie as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? The dead can tell a story if you know how to listen. Dame Sue Black understands the language spoken by all that remains of a body. She knows what should and should not be there, like bruises, cuts, holes, crushed bones. She is a forensic anthropologist.
Forensic anthropology comes from two words. The forensic bit is Latin, which means pertaining to the court, and the anthropology bit just means the study of man. So if you were to put them together, it's the study of man for the purposes of the court, but the reality is that it's about identification. So who is the individual, who was the individual, and can we assist the investigative authorities, whether that's police or otherwise, to determine what might have happened to that individual.
Individuals like Gemma McCluskie. Her father spoke outside court after an exhaustive 10-month police investigation which uncovered scarcely believable events.
Good night, God bless Gemma. We all miss you and love you. Thank you.
So in effect, two of the children that Tony Sr. has are no longer part of his life. And that really was, I think, significant.
It would be a grisly murder for the police to solve, one featuring tales of abduction, false trails and subterfuge.
No one can imagine quite how horrific it must have been to have been told that Gemma had been murdered and that her body had been dismembered, only later to be told that her brother was suspected of being the person who was responsible.
The fact that your daughter is dead is one thing. The fact that she gets murdered is another, but to be murdered and dismembered by your own son or by your brother, it was just an awful time for them. And it is, that part of the investigation kind of still sits with me and many of the team in terms of, the impact that had on the family and Gemma's close friends, because she did have an awful lot of very close friends.
How had police got their man? So-called sororicide, when a brother kills a sister, is very rare. Tony McCluskie had seemed deeply concerned when he first presented at a London police station in the search for the then missing Gemma McCluskie.
He became very involved in the search for Gemma, and because she had been on television in a very famous soap opera, so there was public interest in what had potentially happened to her, and he had put himself really right at the centre of that search for her.
McCluskie himself is the kind of poster child for his poor missing sister. He's pictured in the Sun newspaper holding a missing persons poster.
It was a charade. One evening, Tony McCluskie, not for the first time, had become violent towards Gemma.
It was devastating violence, and it was violence that was always going to end with Gemma's death.
He had grabbed something heavy, smashed it into Gemma's head.
She died as a result of blunt force trauma. How that happened, we don't know.
He says that he doesn't remember what happens, that the last thing he remembers is Gemma coming at him with a knife, and then he can't remember anything after that.
To hide his crime, he decided on a grotesque plan of action, to cut her body into disposable parts.
And suddenly you're faced with a body and you have the panic that says, how do I get rid of it? The vast majority of dismemberments are solely practical for the means of getting the body either out of the environment in which the murder has occurred or to conceal it in small parts within the area where that murder's occurred.
How would the real-life story of the death of a soap star be uncovered? Sue Black's remarkable expertise in forensic anthropology would be vital in revealing the mistake made by Gemma McCluskie's killer. The mystery began when Gemma was first reported missing by her two brothers, one of whom, Tony, walked into a police station on March the 1st, 2012. At first, detectives were not unduly concerned.
The first thing that the police will do whenever there's a missing person report is a kind of a mini victimology. So was Gemma vulnerable in any way? Not really, no. Were her brothers raising any concerns that they think something serious had happened to her? They may not have been at that point. They certainly said something that they had concerns about her boyfriend, but from the police perspective, there were no real vulnerabilities there and no concerns raised, and perhaps she just was staying with a boyfriend.
One day became two. Police and her brothers speculated that she may have gone somewhere, perhaps with a boyfriend.
There was nothing being said that raised any red flags that something might have happened to Gemma. So it may well have been that they were told, well, let's see, try phoning her, let's try calling her, you know, go and speak to her friends and we'll see what happens over the next 24 hours.
Gemma did not appear in the next 24 hours. Her brother, Tony, led a group of over 100 volunteers who leafleted East and South London, looking for leads into Gemma's disappearance, with one hand mysteriously bandaged.
He was obviously very convincing. He was able to convince his brother that he didn't know what happened to Gemma, and he was able to convince the police, so quite possibly he was presenting as quite calm.
Soon to be called into the case, Met Detective John Nicholson.
So Tony was trying to kind of manage the information as it was coming out. He wanted to be the person that was managing that. So at one stage, he was informed that the neighbour had heard Gemma crying. And it was the neighbour's daughter who said to him, "Oh, but what should I do, Tony? Shall I tell the police?" And he said, "Oh, no, leave that with me. I need to speak to your mum first." So, of course, Tony never reported that to the police.
And that would have given him a feeling of having some control over where the search went, over who was a suspect or who wasn't. And he's the kind of person that needs that kind of control. So it doesn't surprise me that he was right in the centre of everything that was going on.
He'd also found out the local community were, they'd put all these leaflets out, people were ringing in. He'd found out, somebody had said that they thought they'd seen Gemma on the Friday at the local kebab shop. So, of course, Tony was happy to pick the phone up to the missing persons inquiry police officer to say, this is what's happened, do you want to get yourself up there? So, in terms of trying to manage and steer the investigation, he was doing what he could to, on the face of it, be helpful, but actually not be helpful at all.
On day 5 of the search, Tony contacted police with a chilling message. Someone had tracked him down and ordered him to pay a ransom for the safe return of Gemma.
And it would have diverted police attention, and because of Gemma having been on the television, it was credible that perhaps that had happened to her.
Had Gemma been abducted? If so, why wait 5 days to demand a ransom? Something else was concerning detectives. They were hearing dark mutterings about Tony McCluskie.
So what we discovered was that there was sibling rivalry.
Too soon to reach a conclusion, but with no sign of Gemma by day 6 of the search, detectives were deeply concerned. Where is Gemma McCluskie? In Dundee, where Dame Sue Black was then based, the search for Gemma McCluskie was not on her agenda.
Like everybody else, you watch the news, and there was an item about a missing person who had been an actress on a soap opera, and that everybody had been out looking for her, including her brother and her family. But that's the level of involvement and knowledge that I had, just the same as the general public.
That was about to change. It was a cold, late winter day when a group of pleasure boaters who use this stretch of the Regent's Canal Basin in northeast London came across a suitcase floating in the water. On colliding with the boat, it sprang open to reveal nauseating contents. There appeared to be a dismembered female body inside.
So I received a phone call from the Metropolitan Police back in March of 2012. And at that point, they had recovered a torso from Regent's Canal that had been encased within a suitcase. And then they had gone back and they had dredged the canal and they had found her limbs as well. At that point, we didn't find her head.
Sue Black was able to tell us with accuracy how many cuts had been made.
It was March 7th. The forensic anthropologist was not needed to identify whose body parts had been found.
We knew it was Gemma. Her torso had a very characteristic tattoo at the base of her spine, and they had taken the DNA sample and they'd been able to compare it with Gemma's DNA. So they knew by that point it was her.
Once Gemma's torso has been found and identified by the tattoo on her body, police are now treating this as a murder inquiry.
Now it was about finding out who in fact was the perpetrator.
Investigations follow the evidence. Detective John Nicholson now needed to find out how Gemma had been killed. The body parts were first examined by a local pathologist. At that early stage of the inquiry, he could not determine how the victim had died.
And he couldn't make his assessment until all the parts of Gemma's body had been recovered. Initially, within the first 2 weeks, Gemma's limbs, her 2 arms and her 2 legs, are recovered within the same body of water but further downstream. But we'd never managed to find Gemma's skull. And without that, all the pathologists could say, he could rule out certain things. For example, he could say it wasn't a gunshot wound. But until we recovered Gemma's head, he wasn't able to say how she had died.
If not how, then when, where, with what, why, and most importantly, to reveal the picture of a killer, who. Gemma's killer clearly had tried to cover his tracks by dismembering her body. Detectives believed that the decision to cut up the body of Gemma McCluskie would reveal some of the answers that they were looking for. It's where Sue Black comes in. Interest in the subject pricked in her childhood.
Every Saturday, every weekend, I spent in a butcher shop, cutting up meat, rolling meat, understanding bones.
She knows all about dismemberment, not a subject just anyone can cope with, but an area of expertise for which she has become world-renowned.
And when I got to university, I studied biology. And in 3rd year, I went into anatomy. And it's a relatively straightforward step from the butcher shop into the anatomy, so that you see the relationship between human and animal.
Crucial facts or probabilities began to emerge as Sue Black considered the evidence in front of her, the body of Gemma McCluskie. First, the very action of cutting a body limb from limb reveals something which is not as obvious as it seems.
A murder has usually occurred before you have dismemberment.
So much more emerges, roughly where the murder has taken place.
Normally, in dismemberments, the victim and the suspect know each other. And so it normally occurs in the property associated with one or either individual. It would be extremely rare for a dismemberment to be stranger-oriented. Most of them are because there's been some form of personal conflict between the 2 individuals.
People have described their relationship almost as if her brother was her boyfriend, because he behaved in a very possessive and jealous way. He kind of took ownership of her, and he tried to control everything that she did, which is classic domestic abuse, classic coercive control. And he was certainly taking the part of a controlling partner.
The psychology of cutting a human limb from limb includes overcoming a challenge few would ever consider they would one day face. As the killer cuts the body, a decision has to be made, to face her or not. This too struck Sue Black.
That was a question asked of me in court. Was she facing upwards or facing downwards when he took her head off? Because there's some really quite emotive psychology within that in terms of looking at the face of your sister whilst you remove her head.
Through forensic examination of the impact of cutting bone, Sue Black was able to discover the answer, to tell the jury of the gruesome ritual which had followed Gemma's murder.
She was lying on her back when he started the dismemberment. So when he was working on her right leg, then she was facing upwards. And he really didn't succeed, so he turned her over. And so for the rest of her dismemberment, she was face down.
That fact established more evidence. Those who do not know their victim are more likely to keep the body facing upwards. Those who do know them turn their bodies to lie on the front so their eyes cannot be seen. Gemma's killer knew her. Of that, detectives could now be confident. A murder story then of people who know each other well and probably in a property one or other lived or worked in. The body also helps tell why a murder has happened. Analysing dismemberment reveals the nature of the attack sudden, spontaneous, perhaps after a row.
The most common form of dismemberment is that which occurs as a result of the fact that the individual had not planned it. So there was no planning of the murder.
The picture of a murderer was building. Gemma's killer had snapped. He knew her, and they were in a building or room one or other owned or worked in. So much revealed by the dismemberment analysis, including an indication of where the body parts would be discarded.
There's been a lot of research in terms of dismemberment, looking at what are the common patterns, what is the common means of disposal, where are they going to go. Most body parts end up in a body of water somewhere. So they end up in canals or rivers or lakes or dropped off at the sea or wherever it may be. We have a tendency to drop into water more frequently than we have to try and bury.
Analysis can also say if the act was done by an amateur or an expert.
So we were involved in a case in London where the dismemberment was done with such incredible skill that we felt this individual had prior experience. So whether they were a surgeon or a butcher or a gamekeeper or something in that sort of line, the body, rather than being cut in an amateur way, was actually jointed more than dismembered. So we can tell the difference when somebody is a real amateur at cutting a body into pieces or whether they have some experience.
Whoever had killed Gemma had no experience, and it showed.
So we were able to advise the police that the first cut started on her right leg. And the cuts that were made there, he started using a normal kitchen knife. It didn't work. There were 56 cuts associated with trying to cut through the bone inside her thigh.
The dismemberment analysis was yielding results.
So we were able to say to the police that this individual who had undertaken the dismemberment was an amateur. They had not done it before.
The type of location such a crime has happened can also be gleaned. If a garden implement is used to cut the body, it's likely to be a suburb or the countryside. If not, then probably a kitchen or a bathroom, which indicates a flat or something similar in a built-up area.
There is a real pattern of what's available to people within their domiciles that we can predict to a greater or lesser extent.
Detectives set about finding and proving a case against the killer. 6 months after her arms, legs and torso had been found, more evidence. Another suitcase discovered by those using the canal, this time containing Gemma's head.
Her head was identified through dental records, so clearly it was Gemma. And the pathologist said that she had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head.
We said it was most likely to have occurred in her property, most likely in a bathroom area, most likely with an implement that would have been taken from the kitchen as a sharp knife, but that there was in fact a heavier blade. There was no garden associated with this flat, so it's unlikely there was a garden shed. It would have been something within the kitchen.
She had 2, perhaps 3 fractures of the skull, and that those fractures had taken place while she was alive because there was still blood staining on the skull itself. So he was able to give that. He could dismiss strangulation. She died as a result of blunt force trauma.
So Gemma had been hit with great strength, indicating a man. She had been known by her attacker and killed in a place familiar to one or both of them. He was probably a stranger to this sort of crime, in a property without a garden, like a flat. He lived not far from water, the likely place to dispatch her remains. He had snapped after some sort of incident, and almost suddenly, Gemma knew her killer.
At the point where the police are concerned, they will always be looking to the people closest first, and they will be looking at the behaviours of people around very, very closely, especially as when a woman is killed, it is more than likely somebody very close to her that has done it.
A missing person inquiry had become a murder investigation, and the evidence was closing in on the killer of Gemma McCluskie. Police knew that whoever had killed Gemma had done so spontaneously. He probably had a violent temper and was somebody close to her. Stories were now reaching detectives suggesting a troubled relationship between Gemma and her brother Tony, with whom she lived in Pelter Street, Hackney, in London.
They had done their background checks on Tony, and they knew that he and Gemma had a volatile relationship and that he was a bully.
And I think from a very early stage, they had their suspicions about Tony McCluskie, and it fitted within the pattern that there had been conflict between brother and sister.
They both had very different personalities. Gemma was very outgoing, she was very socially skilled, she liked her friends, she liked going out, she had a good social life, and she had a very good career as well. In complete contrast, her brother was very much described as a loner, somebody who didn't really have many social skills. He liked to spend a lot of time on his own, and he kind of fixated on his relationship with her as the most important thing in his life. And she was popular and she was successful, and he probably felt a bit jealous of that.
Was Tony McCluskie bully enough to have been his sister's killer? It was fair to say they had their ups and downs.
It seems that from a very young age he was bullying Gemma, pushing her around, he was hitting her, he was being generally really quite horrible to her. He was 6 years older, so, you know, big brother, probably had quite a lot of control over her anyway, but it wasn't a good relationship, it wasn't a nice relationship that they had together, and that didn't get any better as they got older.
Despite that fact, affording a place of their own was made easier by a decision to buy a place together.
They didn't always fall out, but they lived together. It was a small house, small maisonette off the Hackney Road in the East End of London. Gemma was a feisty individual. She had had success in her life. She was very well liked by her family and friends. She had lots of friends, and that was different to Tony. Tony had very few friends.
And when the pair clashed in public, mostly written off as just Gemma and Tony at it again.
Some of the things will get witnessed and can be interpreted as sibling rivalry or brother and sister fighting, or maybe even people would look at it and think, well, he's a bit of a bully, actually. But they wouldn't necessarily be that concerned.
Outside of the family, Gemma would cover for her brother.
The thing about domestic abuse is that most of it is hidden. It's inside the family home, and perhaps between a brother and a sister. They're not going to talk about it to other people.
What would make Tony combustible enough to snap and kill his sister? Few knew of the one specific cause of a growing relationship tension: drugs. Tony was hooked on skunk.
Skunk is a form of cannabis. It's a strain of cannabis. It's been created by breeding cannabis plants to get particularly high levels of the active ingredient in cannabis, THC.
His life really revolved around work, when we could get himself to work, and the fact that he was using skunk as regularly as he did.
Gemma was known to argue with her brother about his skunk use. He didn't like that.
His devotion to the drug caused significant and aggressive changes to Tony McCluskie's behaviour.
So when you smoke it, those usual feelings when you smoke cannabis come on faster, and they come on much stronger. Now, if somebody is susceptible to mental illness, it might exacerbate their symptoms. But it can also trigger kind of psychotic-like symptoms in healthy people who smoke a lot of it as well. So they might start to see things that aren't really there. They're hallucinating. They might start to have delusions where they believe something that isn't really true. It can make them paranoid.
Living with that behaviour was probably not what Gemma expected from her brother. The pair often argued.
There was a difference between the two of them, and of course, you know, him and his life around skunk, and the violent interaction and the arguments.
As Tony would use drugs, so he would become violent, turn on his sister. Investigators discover that there were rows between the couple, sometimes over household disputes, and always over Tony's use of skunk. He would fly off the handle.
He would react almost immediately to a situation which perhaps many others wouldn't have done. Is perhaps a story as to why this happened.
Police did not attach significance to it, but as Tony McCluskie had leafleted to try to find the missing Gemma, he was sporting a bandaged hand. A taxi driver would later say a man, sporting a similarly bandaged hand, got into his cab after loading a heavy case into the taxi's boot. Detective Nicholson had uncovered enough to suggest that impulsive, violent behaviour was a very real possibility when dealing with Tony McCluskie. But a key turning point in confirming who was her killer was still to emerge. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the suitcase in the canal, there was no doubt who was pushing the campaign to find his sister, Tony McCluskie. But as police began to investigate events, further anomalies appeared in his story. 3 days into the search, Tony visits his and Gemma's mum, who was in hospital.
He sends a text message saying, kind of, "Mum's doing fine, I hope you're okay, and love you." And he sends a couple of kisses. And of course, during the investigation, we had a look at all the call data and text messaging between the two of them, and that was the only time he ever said that he loved her, and the only time he ever put kisses on the text message.
He's portraying himself in this text message as a loving brother. That doesn't fit with what other people know about his relationship. That's a glaring inconsistency. He's never said before, "I love you." And if you look at that one text message in isolation, you'd go, "Oh, caring brother." If you look at the other text messages he's sent over the weeks and months, that is unusual.
Texting the words, "love ya," was very much out of character for Tony McCluskie. More inconsistencies emerged.
When he came back from the hospital, he came back and he spoke to Gemma's friends, and he said that his mum had said to him that Gemma had been up there earlier on that day, which clearly wasn't true. And one of the friends that he reported that to said, "Are you absolutely certain about that?" And got Tony to ring the hospital to clarify if that was the case. And of course, he came back off the telephone, the charade of going through that with the telephone, with the hospital itself, and said, "No, I've made a mistake there." But he was trying to lay, say traps, he was trying to cover his tracks along the way.
On March 7th, now a murder inquiry, police asked McCluskie in for an interview.
When the police re-interviewed him, because he would now be a significant witness, and the police would be trying to find out who was the last person to see Gemma alive. And because he lived with her, he was quite potentially going to be the person with that information. And they would have been forensically listening to absolutely everything he said. And when there are inconsistencies in his story, then that is going to raise red flags for investigators.
The previously talkative Tony McCluskie suddenly changed his tone.
When we spoke to him, he gave a no-comment interview.
So they start to ask him more questions, and as those questions become more and more interrogative and he starts to be treated more as a suspect rather than just a concerned brother, he starts to become very defensive. Police ask him questions, he says no comment.
Which is a very strange behaviour for somebody who really wants to find who hurt their sister. Tony seems to be just responding to events as they happen, dealing with them, not in a state of panic, because he does not seem to be in a state of panic, but dealing with them in the way that he thought it was best dealt with. But things were rapidly escalating out of his control.
They find that he makes a phone call to a taxi company on the night that they think Gemma disappears. So they go to the taxi company and they find the driver who took him, and he reports that McCluskie turned up in his taxi cab with a large suitcase, which he claimed was a sound system.
The CCTV of him putting the holdall in the boot of the car, they were all really significant pieces of evidence.
The mistakes of Tony McCluskie were helping police close in on the man who had murdered his sister. Police were now combing through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage. When he'd left the flat, McCluskie's every move was monitored by cameras.
I think a big mistake Tony made was not realising the extent of CCTV cameras, especially in a place like London. They're everywhere. They're recording people's footfall, they're recording traffic movements. You have them outside nightclubs. People, you know, some of these cameras are installed by the police, some of them are installed by local authorities, but increasingly you have private businesses and you have private individuals even installing CCTV cameras. And the police can turn to all of these sources to get images if they have a suspect that they're trying to piece together what they've been up to.
It was inevitable. Tony McCluskie would be caught on camera.
He took Gemma's torso in the suitcase and took the suitcase to the local minicab firm. We also know from his call data that he moved around the area that evening. And we also know from CCTV that he made at least 2 trips from the address. So it's conceivable that he had 2 or possibly 3 journeys, one in the minicab with the torso, and perhaps in the other bags, perhaps on foot that evening.
McCluskie didn't realise it, but his desperate attempts to conceal the murder were falling into an all-too predictable pattern for investigators to discover.
So this was a classic case of dismemberment for the purposes of transportation. The body was in 6 parts, head, torso not cut, because if you cut across the torso, that makes a tremendous amount of mess. So the torso is intact, and the upper limbs, 2 upper limbs, and the 2 lower limbs. The heaviest part, of course, then is the torso. And if you have a large enough suitcase with wheels, and of course that was what happened with Gemma, nobody thinks twice about somebody walking along a pavement carrying a heavy suitcase. And so the trunk is often the most difficult part of the body to dispose of.
Having reported his sister missing and led a leaflet campaign to find her, Tony McCluskie was coming into focus as a suspect in the murder of Gemma McCluskie. He was simply unaware of what evidence he had left behind.
I think people believe they are more forensically aware than they actually are, and that's largely to do with television telling them, you know, I did this and this is what happened. They then have a go at it perhaps themselves and find that it is not easy. It is a really difficult thing to do, to dismember a body, both psychologically but actually physically as well.
This is what had happened that night. Gemma would sometimes lock Tony out of the flat and he would return demanding to be let in. On the night of March the 1st, matters were brought to a head between them because of a flooded bathroom. Barely conscious, probably because of drug use, Tony had left a tap on.
They had an argument over a small flood in the flat that was his fault. And it was the last straw for Gemma, and she had told her friends that she just couldn't take it anymore and she was going to ask him to leave. And it was on the day that she went missing, in fact, that she'd gone back to the flat to tell him that.
Gemma had been out collecting a takeaway. Her brother likely to be doing what Tony McCluskie did, getting wasted on skunk.
With skunk, you know, there's paranoia, there's delusions where they're starting to believe things that aren't really real. You can see how, you know, like a little argument could blow up into something much bigger.
Tony was a person who had no problem resolving his issues through violence, and that had been established throughout his life, especially with the way that he interacted with Gemma. And when he had this major argument with her, he responded with violence.
Violence which would lead to a suitcase of body parts being thrown into a canal later that evening. Left with his dead sister before him, Tony McCluskie decided to throw his sister's body where he felt it might not be found. The nearest water to Pelter Street is a fraction over a mile at Regent's Canal. Too far to walk with a body. But how to remove Gemma without being detected? It is in this moment of the evening's timeline that Tony decides to chop up his sister's body.
Tony did not think things through after he had killed Gemma. One of his biggest mistakes was to try or to think that he could dispose of and hide her body. He thought that that would probably be the easiest thing. It turned out for him that that was his undoing, and that was the most difficult thing that he could have done.
Tony knows there is nowhere to hide Gemma in his small flat. More clues as to the killer's identity would come in what he did next, because he did not know how to do it. The method of dismemberment becomes apparent. All very amateur.
Initially, Tony uses a knife, and that's not successful.
He then turned her body over, tried again, and it still wouldn't cut through. He then found a much bigger blade, probably a meat cleaver.
It takes a lot of work to cut a body up into lots of different pieces.
Tony McCluskie knows he'll need transport. He doesn't own a car.
The reason Tony had called for a minicab to take the torso away is because what could he do? He didn't have a driving licence. He'd never ever driven a car before. He'd never been shown how to drive a car before. He's killed his sister. How is he going to get rid of her body or her torso? And I'm guessing that's what went through his mind, and he thought, right, okay, there's a local minicab firm.
A huge mistake for a killer to make.
He takes Gemma's torso, as we know, and he throws it into the canal less than a mile away from his house. What we do know is that when it came to the post-mortem, Gemma's torso was only weighed 5 stone, but that in itself, if you're carrying 5 stone on your own a mile across East London, that was very, very difficult, and the risk involved. So we're guessing that that's why he made the decision to, you know, call a minicab firm.
By identifying the cab, detectives were able to track it down and check in the boot for evidence which might yield DNA. A spot of blood had leaked from the bag in which Tony had placed his sister's body parts.
Once they've found traces of blood, they can then take a swab of that blood isolate some cells and extract the DNA and try and find out if that blood matches the DNA from the person they're trying to identify, in this case, Gemma.
The blood source DNA did match Gemma's. A search of the flat yielded yet more. As predicted by Sue Black, he'd cut up her body in the bathroom where microscopic fragments of her body were found. The case against Tony McCluskie was complete.
The blood in the boot of the car, the body matter that is found in the bathroom were clearly significant. The CCTV of him putting the holdall in the boot of the car, they were all really significant pieces of evidence that helped convict him.
McCluskie claimed that he had blanked out when he appeared in court on a charge of murder of his sister. If the jury had believed him, the charge might well have been downgraded to manslaughter, which he was prepared to admit.
It's possible that he was in some kind of skunk-induced delusion, but then it seems unlikely that he wouldn't remember anything. I mean, it takes a lot of work to cut a body up into lots of different pieces, pack them into a suitcase, take the suitcase out, dispose of the body, come back to your flat and then clean the body. That's not something you can do in 5 minutes. That takes a lot of work, and it seems unlikely that he wouldn't be able to remember any of that. So he's continuing to lie, either to himself, to other people, to this day, and he's never expressed any remorse.
The jury rejected his claim. 10 months after killing her, dismembering her body, dragging it through the streets and casting it into the canal, Tony McCluskie was found guilty of Gemma McCluskie's murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years.
It's aggravated homicide, so that means that it carries a greater prison sentence. There is the psychology of what he did to his own sister that his family have to now deal with. So that was a huge burden that he placed on his family in terms of the desecration of the body of his sister. And that, I think, is where the most challenging thing is for family and for friends and relatives of somebody. Not only have they lost them because they've been murdered, but they've also been dismembered over above that. And the very fact that he was her brother just compounds the difficulty.
Gemma McCluskie had achieved what so many young actors aspire to, a role on a prime-time TV soap. She was a success. Her brother was not. The part-time window cleaner was a skunk adult junkie whose violent moods were taken out on his sister with whom he lived. He had made lots of mistakes in his lifestyle choices and after the worst thing he'd done in his troubled life. Ironically, the immediate aftermath of Gemma's life was captured on camera, her brother's mistakes filmed for all to see. And his chosen method of hiding the truth was one which provided a body of evidence, his brutal cuts on Gemma's body betraying his panic, inexperience, even the room that he had done his grisly work, and the type of flat that he lived in. A killer's mistakes, revealed on a body which sent messages to an expert who knew how to read them.
Good night, God bless Gemma. We all miss you and love you. Thank you.
Broad daylight in East Cleveland. An ordinary day until one moment, something out of the ordinary.
What happens on October 20th, 2009 is about to change everything. This 911 dispatcher gets a call. The caller is frantic.
She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor. Okay. She laying on the ground, butt neck.
He's just watched this woman come flying out of the second-story window. And he's saying, she's on the ground here. They're saying, is she alive? Is she breathing?
With her right now? I'm right here right now. She's laying on the ground, butt neck.
She just came flying out of this window. He doesn't know if she was thrown, if she jumped, if she fell. He just knows there's something wrong here.
There's a man inside the house. His name Anthony Sowell.
You know, he told the police, well, we were just using drugs together, and she accidentally fell out of the window.
Sowell has already enticed 11 women to use drugs inside 12205 Imperial Avenue.
He selected his victims from a group of people in a community that would be hesitant to step forward and be witnesses.
I got mad and I was like, cussed him out and told him to get out of the house.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Anthony Sowell as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? There is a gap between buildings in East Cleveland where once stood number 12205 Imperial Avenue. As long as Anthony Sowell could hide what is inside 12205, he would remain a free man. Because inside, he's hiding grim secrets. In one room, the decomposing bodies of 2 women. In another, a further 3. And outside in his yard, yet more. What is known about the man who had frightened a woman so much that she threw herself from the 2nd story of 12205 Imperial rather than stay a second longer? A man who would spend hours being interrogated by police and who seemed at ease throughout as he proudly discussed his 4 grandchildren.
You have 4? Yeah, 4. They call you Papa or Grandpa?
Oh.
Yeah?
And
you love that, don't you?
No.
You do.
It's okay, no. But that's everybody call me that.
Yeah, that's the love for them. So I know that you probably be skinning and grinning.
Yeah.
Don't you? Don't you? You don't be grinning when they be coming up to you?
Anthony Sowell seemed happy in police company, happy in the company of everyone.
Many times when somebody is arrested, you hear their neighbors say, they were so quiet. I never knew there was anything wrong. I didn't think that they were capable of such a crime. I can't believe that that is my neighbor that did that. And that's what makes them so effective, is that they can blend in.
He really had this kind of outward appearance to the neighborhood where he would hold barbecues and chat with people. They didn't really suspect him of doing anything like this.
He could snap. People had seen him lose his temper.
So it's kind of these 2 personalities that people would describe seeing. You know, he had at least 1 or 2 girlfriends at the time that we were able to hear from afterwards who talked about, you know, the long conversations they would have and how, you know, kind and introspective he could be. But then he could also be very violent if someone disagreed with him or didn't say the right things.
But a killer, not Tony Sowell, the party guy.
There is no sign, no neon sign on anybody that says I'm a serial killer, I kill for a living. There is no sign at the intersection that you often see people hold, the I will work for food. They're not holding signs that say I will kill for pleasure.
Anthony Sowell's killing story begins to be uncovered with a 911 call.
She looked like she around about 40.
About 40? All right.
Yeah.
Is she conscious?
She can't get up, though.
But she is awake, right?
Look, I ain't even trying to go near her. I gave her my T-shirt to put on.
Is she awake?
She kind of awake and going in and out.
Breathing?
Yeah.
And which window did she fall out? The first or the second?
Oh, no.
Was it less than 6 feet or more than 6 feet?
The second, yeah, 12, 15
All right.
feet.
All right. There we go. And it happened just now, correct?
Yeah.
The call had been made in a neighborhood of East Cleveland where violence was not uncommon. In fact, a year ago, another woman had fled from 12205.
December 2008, a woman in the neighborhood named Gladys Wade frantically flags down a police car. She tells the officers that she was attacked. She's got scratches on her neck. She's got a deep gash in her right thumb. And she says what happened is Anthony Sowell asked her if she wanted to go drink beers with him. And when she said no, he punched her in the face, knocked her out, and dragged her into his house, where he proceeded to choke her and tried to rip off her clothes. She said he had just this evil look in his face. She said it was like the eyes of the devil were glowing, and she said she fought back and tried to scratch his eyeballs out.
Police visit the owner of 12205 Imperial, where the attack had taken place, and hear a different story from Anthony Sowell. Gladys had hit him, he said. The officers decide this is a domestic. They don't want to get involved, and they want to quickly get out of the house. It is littered with trash and smells very badly.
They smell this horrible stench, but they see trash everywhere. It's just a pit.
They wanted to get away from the neighborhood too.
Mount Pleasant. The name Mount Pleasant at that time really was almost cruelly ironic, because the neighborhood by then had really hit the skids. There was a lot of poverty. 1 in 5 houses was up for foreclosure. There was a lot of crime. This was a rough neighborhood. A lot of the residents of the area had fallen victim to the crack epidemic of the time, and a lot of those people were women. And so they would roam the streets, searching for their next hit, and that made them easy prey for ruthless predators like Anthony Sowell.
Not that he was considered a predator. As likable as he appeared to be to some, not many did actually know much about Anthony Sowell.
You know, he wasn't a person that everybody immediately had a specific memory of, but he was kind of always in the background, maybe a little bit socially awkward.
Sowell was an ex-serviceman. He'd been a model Marine.
Maybe the stringent rules in the military were good for him for a while. I know that he was able to, cope in the military, do his job. He listened, he followed orders, directions, never really got in a lot of trouble.
He would later tell probing detectives of his pride at his record.
How long were you in the service?
7 years.
7 years?
He'd done a 7-year tour of duty, and from everything that we know, he did well. He was a good serviceman.
You re-enlisted? You like being in the Marine Corps?
I was good at it.
Yeah.
In 1989, 4 years after leaving the military, it all begins to go wrong.
When he gets out, he starts having problems. He breaks up with his girlfriend, he stops going to work, and he loses his job, and then he turns to drinking pretty heavily. He's pretty much drinking all day. Beer was his vice, and things are kind of falling apart for Anthony Sowell.
The drunk Sowell would target vulnerable women and entice them back to his place. And then things would get ugly.
It wasn't long that he was home before he was actually accused of harming several women. And actually 2 in kind of close proximity. There was 2 women, both of whom were pregnant, but also, either abusing drugs or hanging out with people who were drinking, that Anthony Sowell was accused of raping.
His accuser, a pregnant woman, claims that he wouldn't let her go after she agreed to spend time with him.
A woman goes to police and she tells them that Anthony Sowell attacked her inside his home, that he bound and gagged her and raped her.
Sowell avoids jail, but not for long.
He was never prosecuted for that case because he was actually arrested for another case, another rape, within the same year. And he was prosecuted in that case. He ended up pleading guilty to attempted rape and was given a sentence of up to 15 years in prison.
Sowell refuses to plea deal to contest what had happened, and he declines the chance of early release by admitting his guilt.
His parole is repeatedly denied. When he gets out, because he's served his entire sentence, he's not on parole. So he's not under police supervision. As a sex offender, he has to register, and police have to verify his address, but that's pretty much it. He's pretty much free and clear.
In 2005, Anthony Sowell is released. After a long prison stretch, during which time he'd been a model prisoner, he's back in 12205 Imperial Avenue, where police in the East Cleveland neighborhood are dealing with a drugs epidemic. Because of his offense, he's on the sex register and dutifully attends the sheriff's office every 90 days as ordered. He was not someone they considered a problem ex-con. He was Tone, the party guy from Imperial.
Serial killers also tend to be very smart, almost sociopathic, some of them can be, and your sociopaths can also be very charming. And when somebody is charming, people like them. They have relationships, they build families and friends, and so therefore, people aren't going to question them. They would never imagine that Anthony Sowell or other serial killers out there could do the evil that they do.
By 2007, Tony Sowell was living alone at 12205 Imperial, his parents having passed away. Drugs had flooded the Mount Pleasant neighborhood.
The city was kind of getting poorer. There was the crack epidemic was really starting to affect the streets. There was a lot of mothers and fathers starting to use those drugs.
Sowell set about preying on the women made vulnerable by their dependence on drugs. His own days were dominated by booze.
He was really the kind of guy that was doing a lot of drinking. He'd go to the store in the morning and get a beer and just kind of continue that throughout the day.
A pattern was set. The drunk Sowell would home in on vulnerable women and entice them back to his place. 12205 Imperial Avenue became quite the party venue.
He would say, hey, do you want to come in and have a drink? And his house was a place where he would let people crash if they were using drugs and didn't want to go home. The house, you could tell, it was definitely used for a place where people could just crash and could just party. There was beer bottles or beer cans all around.
The run-down quarter of East Cleveland offered perfect conditions for the predator Sowell. Drug-confused women, a place of his own to take them, and a meeting venue where he could also get beers.
There was a little corner store right there that was kind of the hub of activity on Imperial Avenue. They were really familiar with Anthony Sowell. He would come in and buy, tall beers, King Cobra beers, which he would drink often. People would come over to the store when they would come to his house, buy beer, party, kind of back and forth.
When partying with Sowell, the menu was easy to predict. He might help cook up some drugs, and he might follow it up with a 6-pack of beers. Then it would be time for sex, whether the women wanted it or not.
Every female that you have brought to the house, have each and every one of them used drugs or using drugs like crack or whatever? Is that one of the reasons why they come to your house? So they can smoke from them. Okay. And you telling me that you don't do that? I used to, but you don't do that.
Sometimes.
On May 17th, 2007, Crystal Dozier was wandering the streets of Mount Pleasant. She spotted by Tony Sowell. She fitted a then all too familiar East Cleveland profile.
And I'm trying to get the type of women that come to your house. And this is the type of women that come to your house are one drug users. Outright drug users. Very sure.
Crystal Dozier was the mother of 7 children. Her own family remembers that Crystal, when she was a little girl, she was the responsible one. She's the one you could always count on. And she loved helping around the house and learning how to cook, and she really liked pretending she was a grown-up. She loved getting dressed up. But drugs changed everything.
Did you like him, though? Did you like him when you met him?
Yes.
Okay. So you weren't mad at him when you met him. You kind of liked him all, right?
Yes.
And by the time she was in her early teens, her life was just basically spinning out of control. She never shook her drug habit.
They all had these vulnerabilities that Anthony Sowell appeared to hone in on.
So I looked at her, and she looked so sad and pitiful, like she just had a rough rough time. So I said, a beer? I said, how you gonna get a beer? I said, it's closed. Oh, they'll open up or something like that. Okay. So I said, I tell you what, come on with me. You can get all the beers you want.
Sowell invited her into 12205. He has raped before, but he has never killed. Nothing would be heard about Crystal for 2.5 years, her anguished family unable to find her. She had been raped, then strangled.
The most personal way to kill somebody is to strangle them. And in Anthony's case, it was personal and close. And so he was able to watch and literally watch the breath of life come out of that person.
Her killer buried Crystal by the backyard fence of 12205. She had become victim number 1 of Anthony Sowell. There was no reported sighting of Crystal before her murder. Possibly she had been whisked into 12205 in darkness. Possibly detectives were not getting all of the information they could from a community at times at odds with the police.
He selected his victims from a group of people in a community that would be hesitant to step forward and be witnesses.
Other drug-addicted women were lured into 12205 around the same time.
And those women had gone to Anthony Sowell's house maybe to use drugs or drink or just hang out with him and had never left the home.
As for Sowell, he was not suspected of any involvement in the disappearance of Crystal Dozier. There's even a suggestion that he may have tried to mend his ways.
He participated in Alcoholics Anonymous, so he was aware that he had an alcohol problem.
AA did not work. There is no indication that Sowell took a day off from his heavy drinking. And when he was drunk, he would want to have sex. He would head out looking for a sex worker. One like Tashana Culver, who went missing in June 2008, a young woman drifting in and out of family life.
Tashana Culver had tried to get clean. It just never took. The pull of the drugs was just too strong. But she had once had hopes and dreams. She'd gotten her cosmetology license. She'd even trained to be a medical assistant. But drugs basically consumed her life. She was 33 years old. She had 6 children.
Her family was slow to report her missing. She'd disappeared so often. She was dead within 2 hours of entering 12205. His killing method of choice were his bare hands. Sowell had perfected strangling by now.
They will learn, they'll do everything the same, but this time they'll bring a gun. So it also is a learned behavior. They learn from their mistakes. And so throughout the years, Anthony learned from his mistakes and kept on trying to protect his craft.
Can you tell me exactly what did you do with your hand?
I can, that's why I can tell you there wasn't no weapon.
He didn't start out killing. I would bet that he learned and progressed to that point. And as he was successful with his first rape, he would do the next one and the next one and try new things. And in this particular case, ultimately, as a serial killer, he got the thrill from watching his victims die.
What, they would like piss you off or something maybe? Or what? What do you think would cause you to choke them? I mean, just off the top of your head. Think about it. Understand?
My girl and them, something. That's all I can say.
That was punishing them because of...
I was the punish. Like, was the punish. I can't explain.
As for the residents of Mount Pleasant, all they knew for sure was that something bad was coming from somewhere in the neighborhood.
Before long, people in the area start complaining about this horrible smell in the neighborhood. It is just a rotten stench. At least one neighbor calls the city and says, you gotta do something about this. This is just horrendous. It smells like something died, something or someone, but it kind of gets waved off by the authorities.
Right next to the house where Anthony Sowell lived on Imperial Avenue was a place called Ray's Sausage. And for years, when there had been foul odors that the neighbors noticed, they would call the city or call the health department. When people would come out, they would always attribute the smells to Ray Sausage. And in fact, the people that own this very small family-owned sausage company redid their entire sewer system, thinking that somehow this smell was being attributed to them, their sausage making, their dumpsters. You know, we only realized later that it was probably Anthony Sowell. And in fact, the owner said at one point that they believed that he may have dumped some bodies in their dumpsters.
The upshot after the complaint was that an opportunity to stop a killer killing was ignored.
The smell remains, and it just hangs over this neighborhood, just this rotten stench. The house where Anthony Sowell is living is just filthy, full of garbage, and definitely there's this horrible smell coming from there, but nobody ever does anything.
No mistake yet big enough for cops to stop Sowell, who carries on picking up sex workers when drunk and attacking them, not always successful in his attempts to kill them.
There was a number of women who actually made it out of Anthony Sowell's house, and each of them also described either being choked or strangled by him quite aggressively, sometimes with like a cord or a strap, other times with his hands.
I was punished. I can't explain it.
Those who had escaped Sowell's punishment had not told police of their ordeal, fearful that they may be arrested for drug use and prostitution themselves. One woman would not reveal what she had seen inside 12205 until Sowell was safely locked up.
She caught a glimpse of one of the decomposing bodies, which frightened her and just made her, realize, I have got to get out of here.
So, what went on behind the door of 12205 Imperial remained undetected, uninvestigated. Sowell's good fortune and the fact that he was yet to make the mistake of attracting the police to his door meant that he was still free. Between 2007 and 2008, women continued to go missing from Mount Pleasant.
Their loved ones that they did love would go missing, but they would always call after a day or two. They would always come back. They would never miss important events like birthdays or Christmas. And so when they went missing for a longer period of time and didn't show up, a lot of them contacted the police and said, this is different. And we're basically told, hey, they'll come back when they're done using drugs.
After all, who cares about women who often go missing for a living? 1 minute on the streets, the next selling sex in a location nobody knows on. Sex workers make perfect targets for serial killers.
So the police were dismissive of these women for the same reason that Anthony Sowell likely targeted them.
Anthony picked his victims because they were vulnerable.
All his targets were black, drug-addicted, and desperate for cash. Choosing the same profile of victim is familiar territory for serial killers and rapists too, like Anthony Sowell.
The very first time that they're successful, they will continue to do the crime the same way every single time. Rapists are no different. If they were successful with a brunette living in an apartment, all their victims will be brunettes living in an apartment.
I think he probably knew that people weren't going to come, beating down his door looking for these women.
And so the killing went on. LaShonda Long's life had never been easy.
LaShonda Long was the youngest of Anthony Sowell's victims. She was only 25. LaShonda's mom had been a crack addict. Her dad had been an alcoholic. And LaShonda's life pretty much fell into that pattern.
It was only a matter of time before Sowell would find her. She was simply not able to defend herself, her life distorted by drugs and bad choices.
LaShonda had her first child when she was just a child herself. She was 14 years old. At 17, she had 3 children, and she'd lost custody of all of them.
He hated the fact that they used drugs and would even say things to them about it, and he wanted to help them, but then he would also do it himself. So he definitely had this strange relationship where he would meet women who had drug problems. He would kind of entice them into his home with the idea of drinking or using drugs. But then he would also try to be very caring. Well, let me get you some clothes. Let me feed you. You look like you need to eat.
I know one thing I think always made me mad is they had kids.
And they was out in the street.
Yeah. That's a big thing in my head.
LaShonda's fate was to be a gruesome one.
One family, I think it was LaShonda Long, the only thing they really recovered of her body was her head. It was in a bucket in the basement, which was very difficult for them. They didn't even have a body to bury.
Sowell would describe his victim as pitiful, but he himself took no pity on them. The next woman to be enticed inside Imperial 12205 was Tonya Carmichael.
Tonya Carmichael vanished in November of 2008. She was 33 years old. She was a drug addict, but she hadn't always been. She was once the protective mother who would chase away the drug dealers from her doorstep because she didn't want them to influence her children. But eventually she fell into drugs.
Her life kind of intersected with Sowell's early on. They both grew up on Page Avenue. She knew him, probably tangentially. The families kind of knew each other.
The addiction had led her to crime, to prison, away from her children, and eventually into the hands of a serial killer.
She went looking for a hit and a bed for the night and chose 12205. She was not long for this world after taking that decision.
When she initially went missing, her family went to police and they were asking for help to find her. And the police said, well, we know she has a drug problem. She'll come home when she's done using drugs.
When Tonya went missing, her family says they went to police right away. The police told them, just wait.
And this family really, they put up flyers. They were really searching for her, especially her daughter, Danita Carmichael, really cared for her mom deeply and was searching for her. And so this was really difficult for her.
She would never see her mom alive again. One day, Sowell would describe her fate and that of others. His favored method of murder was to use an electric cord or any cable nearby before pinning his victims to the ground. He would act quickly, subduing in seconds, showing no mercy.
I don't know. I think I just should.
Choked him.
Nothing like beat,
Yeah.
No.
In 2018, an investigation would begin about why detectives had failed to arrest Sowell before he was eventually hauled in for questioning. His killing was relentless. Next to enter the foul stench of his crack den was Michelle Mason.
Michelle Mason was finally getting the life she'd always wanted. She had spent so many years in a haze of drugs. She was hooked on heroin and crack. But by 2001, she was really starting to get things turned around. And her family just remembers this was really the happiest time of her life. She was living on her own. She had friends, real friends, and she had kicked her drug habit. She was clean and sober.
But one day in 2008, she seems to have come across Anthony Sowell.
On an October morning in 2008, when Michelle left the house and said she'd be back, and she never came back, her family knew something was wrong. They filed a missing persons report. They put out flyers all over the neighborhood.
15 months after claiming his first victim, Anthony Sowell has killed again for the 5th time.
On October 29th, 2009, some Cleveland police officers, some detectives actually went to Anthony Sowell's home on Imperial Avenue, and they were looking to arrest him. A woman had accused him of rape. When they went to the house, he was not there.
So they went away, figuring the overwhelming smell, which they could not miss, was from Ray's sausage store next door. How many more women would Anthony Sowell attract to 12205? What mistakes would he make before police would finally arrest him? It was October 20th, 2009, when a man walking on Imperial saw a woman falling from an upstairs window of 12205. He didn't know her, but it was obvious something very bad had been going on.
12205 Imperial.
He'd got away with so many rapes and murders, Sowell sets about trying to get away with this latest attack.
A week later, she does talk. She goes to police and she tells them what happened.
The Cleveland police, who had known about complaints related to the man who lived inside 12205, knew about his past as a convicted rapist. They only now decided to go inside and take a good look around.
October 29th, police go to Anthony Sowell's home with a search warrant and an arrest warrant. Sowell isn't there. They go inside. The place is just unbelievable. It's trash everywhere, clothes strewn around. It smells unbelievable.
They entered the home and they found the bodies of 2 women who were basically sitting out in the open, decomposing.
They're just lying there, rotting, and they're next to a shovel, and the police don't know what they have on their hands here, but they know they need help, so they call in other officers to help.
Once they found that, they called in a lot more police and some crime scene investigators. And over the course of maybe a week or more, they found many more bodies.
There was no immediate sign of Anthony Sowell, but it wouldn't be long before he reappeared in the neighborhood.
On October 31st, police find Anthony Sowell walking down the street about a mile from the house. They arrest him. They charge him with 5 counts of murder. But the bodies keep turning up.
Detectives are staggered to learn that Sowell does not know how many bodies he had hidden around his property.
All I can say is under 10. That's all I. So, hold up. Let me see.
If you were in my shoes, what would you want me to tell you? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
They cordon off the house, they cordon off the yard. They find 3 more bodies in the house, 2 in a crawl space.
It turns out that there was 11 women total who had gone missing since about 2007.
So we have 11 women, all of them black, missing since 2007, all dead, all here at the house at 12205 Imperial Avenue.
The identifications of the women begins. Christelle Dozier, Tashana Culver, Tonya Carmichael, LaShonda Long, Michelle Mason. They hear the stories of others, like Kim Smith.
Kim Smith loved her father. She and her father took care of each other. He had a spinal injury and had trouble getting around, so Kim she looked after him. She would get him to his doctor's appointments. She would cook for him. But Kim was hanging out with the wrong crowd. She was smoking a lot of crack. And she was little by little not showing up as often. When she disappeared, her family didn't report her missing.
You had a body that was right here. You had a body that was over here. You had a bag that was a body in there. Oh my God. Hold on, look, I ain't finished. And you got a body behind the wall.
Okay. Well, a lot of dirt back there, too.
A lot of dirt all over that body.
Next was Nancy Cobb.
In April of 2009, Nancy went missing. Her family filed a missing persons report. They put up flyers all over the neighborhood at the local businesses, on telephone poles, everywhere. They were frantic to find her.
They never did. They identify Imelda, known as Amy Hunter.
Amy Hunter adored books when she was a little girl. Her family called her a bookworm, and they said that she really loved reading the classics. But Amy's life would not have a storybook ending. By the time she was 14, she was pregnant, reportedly by a teacher who got her drunk at a party. Her baby was born deaf and with cerebral palsy, and Amy was devastated, and her friends said that she turned to crack cocaine as a sort of comfort. And and it really took over her life.
A life which ended inside the Sowell House of Horrors. Sowell, under interrogation, affects madness. It was all a dream, he says. He did not know real from unreal. They ask him about another woman identified. Her name, Janice Webb.
Janice Webb always loved her East Cleveland neighborhood where she grew up. It was home to her, and she loved her family. But unfortunately, she fell into the same trap that so many people in the neighborhood had fallen into, and that was the drugs.
You got 4 bodies up top. You got 1 body in the basement. There's no more room in the house for bodies. So you gotta go outside. This would make her most likely the last one.
Not the last one. Talacia Fortson was Sowell's 10th victim, a mother of 3 whose drug problems meant that her children had been taken away from her. Her remains found buried in the garden.
In early June of 2009, Talacia dropped by her adoptive mom's house to bring her some groceries. And then she left saying she'd be back, and she never came back. Her adopted mom reported her missing.
Diane Turner, mother of 6, was victim number 11. Her body remained unclaimed, unrecognized in the city morgue for nearly a year.
She had been sober for almost 2 full years. Unfortunately, she never really learned how to be a good mom. And so the authorities said that she was a danger to her child, and they took her baby away when her baby was just 4 days old, and it devastated her. So pretty much then is when her family and friends say that Diane just gave up. Her body was found in the 3rd floor bedroom of Anthony Sowell's home at 12205 Imperial Avenue.
The interrogation was not a difficult one if the target was to get a confession. Sowell could hardly deny his guilt, and any pretense of insanity soon disappears. For interrogators, the priority was to get the truth out of Anthony Sowell, not to show how they were feeling, shock at hearing of how a serial killer had behaved quite so monstrously.
As detectives, you have to remove the emotional side as far as looking at that person's life. It's important to know the facts and who that person is, who your victims are, and sometimes you get to know the families very well, and you feel it's a calling, it's a mission to be able to provide answers to what happened to their child or their loved one.
Sowell had appeared as a party guy with a warm welcome to the women of Mount Pleasant, whose lives had taken a terrible turn for the worse, and they had trusted him. The mistake Sowell had made in order for detectives to be led to a macabre mausoleum at 12205 was simple. He allowed one victim too many to escape.
That was Anthony Sowell's killer's mistake. He let one of his victims get too close to a window, and she did what she had to save her life. She jumped out that 2nd-story window. She's the one who got away. And that's what it took to get Anthony Sowell finally arrested, finally stopped from his killing spree.
Campaigners argued in 2018 that it was a killing spree which could and should have been stopped after the first report of a woman who had gone missing. And again, after women had lived to tell the tale of torture inside 12205.
It was a sobering moment for Cleveland to realize that 11 citizens could go missing and nobody could make the connection that they were all in the same place, had all been killed by the same man.
For a while, the house was left standing, a reminder of Sowell's crimes where artifacts of the women had been abandoned. Clothing and jewelry left behind in the upstairs apartment of his home. The decision was taken in 2010 to pull down 12205.
People moved quickly to get control of the house. so that they could knock it down. And within the year, the house was bulldozed and made into an empty lot. And there's been plans in the works for almost 5 years now to put some kind of memorial at that site. I think it left the whole community numb. How could we let this happen? How could we let this happen?
How indeed. Sowell had killed and raped and killed, over a 3-year period, at the end of which time his mistake was to run out of luck when a survivor convinced police to look under the trash inside 12205.
Essentially, people like Anthony Sowell and other serial rapists that have since been discovered, they were smarter than the police. They were smarter than the community. They knew that these women, and they, the women probably knew in some ways too, that nobody would care.
Police had been warned about Sowell on a number of occasions and even had the right to ask to go inside the home of the registered sex offender. But they did not dig too deeply into a man who lived in a neighborhood that officers did not like to frequent.
Actually, sheriff's deputies visited his house, and he had to check in regularly as a sex offender. And I think the same week as these bodies were discovered, they had checked in on him at his home, and they had just never entered his home because that wasn't part of what they did. If they did, they probably would have noticed something amiss or smelled the foul odor that neighbors had been complaining about for years, but couldn't really pinpoint, where it was coming from.
The detective story which led police to the house of a serial killer does not reflect well on the Cleveland police force. That they got the final piece of the puzzle into the disappearance of women in Mount Pleasant was more about luck than judgment. Kidnap women too often, and eventually one will escape to raise an alarm that will finally be heard.
She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor. Okay, are you there? She laying on the ground, butt neck. Are you?
Sowell was given the death penalty in 2011. The sentence was never to be carried out. He died of natural causes in 2021. A world-renowned city of learning, one boasting a thriving market in books.
The first edition market is quite a buoyant one, and in terms of the top-level books, they can be worth a huge amount of money.
And where there's money, there is crime. Amidst the honey-coloured stone and splendour of Oxford, a brutal murder.
Following the discovery of a man's body in Oxford on Thursday the 7th of April, we have launched a murder investigation. Although he hasn't been formally identified, I'm satisfied that person is a man called Adrian Greenwood, who was 42 years old.
There was a frenzied attack. Greenwood was stabbed multiple times.
And taken from his house, a copy of Wind in the Willows worth £50,000. Bizarrely, the killer pauses as he escapes the scene.
He takes a photo of himself outside the house with blood on his face. I don't know what he was thinking.
He was thinking big and targeting the rich and famous.
Once they start looking at what's on that laptop, they find this Excel spreadsheet hit list, which besides Adrian Greenwood's name, they also find several wealthy celebrities' names, including Kate Moss and Simon Cowell.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Michael Danaher as guilty of murder? What would be a killer's mistake? It's a story which could have been lifted from one of the novels of Colin Dexter and the depictions of his central character Morse in a British TV series. The brutal murder of an author who was part of a closed world in Oxford, one where books are a currency which create wealth. where collectors of all backgrounds will pay what it takes.
Sometimes it's with a view to investment, but more commonly it's the sort of obsessive activity that you often get with collecting.
Undiscovered in family cupboards, garages, on bookshelves and in antique shops, there are rarities worth tens of thousands of pounds. To sell for that much is often about the nuances of what a book has to offer.
Often the value is based on particular attributes. The presence of a dust jacket, the presence of an author's signature, where the author's signature is uncommon, can make a huge difference to the value and add tens of thousands of pounds.
In 2016, Adrian Greenwood was an almost stereotypical product of the Oxford academic world. He had read politics, philosophy and economics at Christ Church College and stayed on in the city. By his early 40s, he was living not far from where he'd been a student. He was a twice-published author, dealt in classic cars and works of art, and had become one of a select few trading in rare books.
Mr. Greenwood is well known in Oxford, and we know that, or we believe that he was running a number of businesses.
He was a collector of historical books, antique books, books of historical interest, first editions, that sort of thing.
Within Oxford, there were only really sort of three or four people at a time in terms of actual dealers with premises or websites and that sort of actual businesses as such. So it's quite a close community, and with that, a fairly competitive community.
Greenwood had become highly considered in the closed book world, good at the hard sell, a natural at uncovering rarities.
Dealing in rare books as opposed to general book selling has different processes that take a large amount of your time. There's a lot of research that goes into both finding the books originally and finding out about the books when you've got them in hand, and you need to be able to catalogue them and turn them into something of interest. A lot of that is storytelling, making the books sound interesting, because if people are going to part with a large amount of money, they want to have a real feel for the book and a sense of value and interest that they can share once they have it as their own possession.
Adrian Greenwood focused on a lucrative speciality.
He specialised mostly in modern first editions and had a line in particular authors such as J.K. Rowling, and fine copies of particularly scarce books. He was somebody that was able to find things that other people couldn't, essentially, which is a large part of the trick.
A trick that Greenwood had pulled off.
Adrian Greenwood had a first edition of a Harry Potter book.
With the J.K. Rowling books, they are a phenomenon in the sense of contemporary authors whose work has almost immediately become collectible in a very high sort of bracket of value. The first book in particular can go for tens, £20,000 if it's in any sort of good condition.
His discovery of the first edition made the news.
And this was seized upon by the local media and local press, and there was a certain amount of publicity around it, and he was photographed and seen to have this valuable and expensive book.
The first edition was exhibited at a book fair, and then it was stolen. Greenwood warned whoever the thief was that getting rid of it would not be easy.
It would be incredibly difficult to resell a book that had been stolen, because both the community of the book trade is closely knit enough that word would circulate that it would make it impossible to sell to the trade, but also any form of public marketing of the book would attract attention, because the interest in finding those particular titles is so large. They're not going to go unnoticed, and obviously you need them not to go unnoticed if you want to sell them. So the idea that you could then resell the book for anything like its original market value just wouldn't be possible.
Sure enough, the stolen Harry Potter first edition was found abandoned outside an Oxford store and subsequently returned to Adrian Greenwood. That was not his only book of value. He had placed an advert online for a copy of Wind in the Willows, with a sale price of just under £50,000. The word was out. Adrian Greenwood had some very valuable books, and at least one person was following the story with a self-serving interest. A man called Michael Danaher.
Michael Danaher was known as the Gentle Giant. He's a large man, very tall, 25 stone or so. He'd worked with his wife at John Lewis in Peterborough, and they had 2 sons. He then left that job and went to work as a manager for an engineering firm. His marriage broke up, but he still maintained contact with his sons, who were at that time sort of 9 and 15 years old, and he saw them at weekends and tried to play his part as their father as best he could in the circumstances.
Michael Danaher, Mr. Ordinary, but one with issues.
Danaher had money problems, serious money problems. He was in debt.
He wouldn't tell his ex-wife or his sons about it, and tried to cope, and tried various means of coping so that he could make life as normal as possible for both himself but also for his sons. And one of the things he did was to look at eBay and find low-value things to buy and then sell on again and make a little bit of money to keep his head above the water. But it wasn't really working, and he was kind of sinking further and further into a sort of morass of debts.
He couldn't see any way out of that, apart from crime.
Not petty crime either. The Gentle Giant wanted to score big. He began researching people to burgle. In early 2016, Danaher trawled the web looking for potential targets. A wealthy donor to a British political party, Adrian Beecroft, was one.
Danaher decided he was a worthy target, and he went and posed as a delivery driver at Beecroft's house in Hampstead. But his wife fought him off, essentially. He tried to push past her, and it was all bungled. And it would have been better for everybody concerned if Danaher had realised at this point this really wasn't his forte, and perhaps his ideas of making money ought to go in a different direction.
The criminal life of Michael Danaher had exposed him as something of an amateur. Still the attentive father at weekends, he was not put off, assiduously researching ways of getting rich quick and illegally.
He effectively found himself a hit list of people that he felt might be vulnerable, might be good targets to yield him a better return than he was getting on buying and selling on eBay. And there were people on that list who were like hedge fund managers and people who weren't known, but there were also celebrities on there who he thought would be vulnerable for some reason to him stealing from them.
TV star and entrepreneur Alan Sugar, model Kate Moss and former footballer Rio Ferdinand were all considered by Danaher as wealthy enough for him to consider breaking into their homes. But Danaher soon decided on an easier target. He remembered the story about the man who dealt in rare books. The two very different worlds of Adrian Greenwood and Michael Danaher were about to collide.
Danaher thinks there's money to be made in second-hand books.
The potential can be 20, 30, 40,000 and up. It's the sort of commodity where if scarcity comes into play and somebody wants it enough, then you're talking X amount.
And one of the people that he clearly discovered during his research on the internet was Adrian Greenwood.
The reason Danaher targeted Adrian Greenwood was because Greenwood had previously appeared in the media talking about the value of rare first edition books, and he thought, I'll get in on this. When Greenwood had appeared in the media, obviously he hadn't really thought about the fact that that would mark him out as a victim. He didn't have security in place. He was just living a normal life in his house in Oxford.
Danaher dug a little deeper. He discovered that Greenwood had valuable books for sale, in particular a first edition of Wind in the Willows, for which Greenwood was asking for £50,000.
Danaher's research also revealed that Adrian Greenwood worked from home. He uncovered precisely where he lived, the Iffley Road in Oxford. The more Danaher read, the more he could dream of what treasures lay inside.
Adrian Greenwood was fairly open about the valuable items that he owned, like this Wind in the Willows book. He'd had publicity, and Danaher had picked up on this. Greenwood really was a victim waiting to happen.
Danaher had already demonstrated that he was no criminal mastermind with his failed attempt at burglary of a family in Hampstead, London.
The stupidity of Michael Danaher is pretty much off the Richter scale.
Undeterred, he now had a new target in mind, the home of a man happy to boast of the valuable books that he had for sale, and who had one in particular on offer. Wind in the Willows, complete with a much vaunted dust jacket.
I can steal that, and maybe some other kind of things. That would bring about the end of my financial worries. He hatched a plan.
He plotted a route from Peterborough in south-central England to Oxford and to the home of Adrian Greenwood. When detectives investigate a case, they're led not by their instincts, but by the evidence they discover. Experienced criminals work hard not to leave a trail. They are wary of digital fingerprints trackable from their online behaviour. Michael Danaher was no criminal mastermind. By the 6th of April, he had left an array of evidence reflecting his plans on his laptop. He'd also made a note next to Greenwood's name in a spreadsheet detailing the pros and cons of potential actions.
He even had a reason column, and the comment against Adrian Greenwood was simply tosser.
Amongst other evidence later found at Danaher's home was a phone, one which had been adapted to work as a stun gun and which Danaher referred to as something he might use.
Danaher really hadn't put a lot of thought into this crime.
On the 6th of April, Danaher drove from Peterborough to Oxford.
Danaher had his target. He may not have known why it was so valuable, but he had seen online that Greenwood was trying to sell a children's book called Wind in the Willows, and he was trumpeting the small but vital attribute that made it very valuable, the one which would tempt collectors into spending big.
The Wind in the Willows is an example of a book that does not normally survive with a dust jacket in terms of what it could sell for. We are talking more like £50,000. Without that, it's you drop a zero off for the same book. That's the difference that thin bit of paper wrapping around the book can make.
Danaher drove the 2 hours from his home in Peterborough and arrived in Oxford. April 6th began as a sunny day. Nobody could possibly know that he was on a mission. He travelled on foot from a city centre car park to Iffley Road. As the day went on, the weather changed. Danaher can be seen that day on security footage.
He was captured on CCTV. A local bus captured Danaher on CCTV a couple of times.
As he walks along the Iffley Road, he can be seen checking inside his bag. It's unlikely that passers-by would have considered him worthy of their attention.
He went to Adrian Greenwood's house.
Greenwood didn't have CCTV. He didn't have a state-of-the-art alarm system in his house. All of these things which he very much should have had.
He was disturbed by Mr. Greenwood in the property, and that's where an altercation or fight took place between them.
There was then a frenzied attack. Greenwood was stabbed multiple times. In fact, Danaher stabbed him so hard with a kitchen knife that the handle snapped off the blade. Greenwood stood very little chance.
Adrian Greenwood was stabbed.
We do know that he ended up stabbing him several times, and Adrian Greenwood bled to death.
A seasoned killer would know not to use the sort of knife that Danaher probably picked up from his victim's kitchen. Still, that seems to be what Danaher took.
The knife is a large kitchen knife. It's not an ideal murder weapon. It might seem like one, but it's really not an ideal murder weapon. If you think about what a kitchen knife is designed for, it's designed for slicing and cutting. It's not designed for repeatedly stabbing into somebody. And so if you have a long knife like that, you might think that bodies are easy to stab, but actually getting a knife through the skin is quite difficult, and then it may go into the body okay, but then if it hits bone, it's going to bend again. So if you're repeatedly doing that with this long knife, it will bend, and if it's a cheap knife, the blade may snap off.
Michael Danaher's descent from happily married man and loving father to killer was complete. What he was about to do was finish the job that he had come for.
After he'd killed Adrian Greenwood by stabbing him multiple times, Danaher was looking around for things to steal.
He took Greenwood's wallet and his phone. On his earlier walk along the Iffley Road, Danaher will have seen that Greenwood received no visitors. He may well have felt confident of not being interrupted. He walked throughout the ground and first floor of the house, stepping in the blood of his victim. And then he left. What he did next has few parallels and exposed both a bizarre state of mind and a total absence of understanding how a later investigation might work. The amateur criminal had already made a catalogue of mistakes. His next one is perhaps the most memorable in the case of the murder of the Oxford bookseller. Michael Danaher took out his phone in broad daylight and captured his image.
When he left after 2 hours, he took a selfie outside the property showing himself there.
Danaher, after he'd murdered Greenwood, even took a selfie at Greenwood's house. Well, of course, that photograph contains a lot of metadata that would be able to place Danaher at that house at that time.
A selfie which displayed the blood of Michael Danaher from a cut that he seems to have sustained during the attack.
I don't know what Danaher was thinking, taking a selfie of himself with blood on his face, but what he should have known is that one of the first things police do these days when they have a suspect is they seize their mobile phone, they seize their computer records, and they'll go through and they'll look at those things like their photos, the text messages they've sent, the phone calls they've made, and that's all evidence against them.
Danaher did not delete the picture.
He's fresh from killing Greenwood. He's just killed him. He's got his blood on his face. And he takes his photograph. Bizarre behaviour, having just killed somebody.
What kind of murderer takes a selfie of himself at the murder scene?
An amateur murderer, perhaps. Inside the home of Adrian Greenwood, a bloody scene. Danaher had not tried to cover his tracks. In fact, he'd stepped in them. He had not considered the presence of his DNA. Earlier in the day, he'd not bothered to consider the presence of security cameras around the city, or on buses which regularly travelled up the Iffley Road. There are 6 million security cameras at work in Britain at any one time. Experienced criminals know all about them, not Danaher. It was still daylight when Michael Danaher left the home of Adrian Greenwood. He had committed only the second crime of his life. The first had been a failed aggravated burglary and extortion. The second had been theft and murder. Both had been desperate attempts to dig himself out of a debt hole and retain face for his 2 children. But the amateur was simply not equipped to be a criminal. In his bag, he now had the rare copy of Wind in the Willows, the contents of Adrian Greenwood's wallet, and Greenwood's phone, still switched on. He had parked just off the road that he had earlier been seen walking along, and now returned to his Citroën Picasso.
He then gets in his car, still carrying Greenwood's mobile phone, and drives back to Peterborough.
We can tell that he's really got no sense of how he might be caught, what things he might have to take care of to make sure that the police can't follow him, because he takes no steps whatsoever to try to disguise the fact that he has made that journey.
As daily life continued in the busy city of Oxford, no alarm had been raised. The horrific murder had been inside a property at a time when neighbours were not at home. If Adrian Greenwood had screamed for help, he hadn't been heard. Danaher was on his way home, and although the killer had left a trail of evidence, one key mistake would still be needed to alert detectives to look for that evidence in the right places, to consider Danaher as a suspect.
Because Danaher was a previous good character, lived 100 plus miles away, no connections to the area, it might have been very difficult to find him and connect him into the murder.
To find the selfie, they'd have to find the phone it was taken with. To compare the murder weapon with knives in Danaher's home, they would need good reason to search his home. Before police could uncover who had killed Adrian Greenwood, they would need a lead for them to connect Danaher to that crime. Even if an image of a suspect would emerge from CCTV, there was no match to Danaher's face on the National Criminal Database.
Danaher had no criminal convictions, not even a caution. He was completely off the police radar.
With no witnesses and no link between Greenwood and Danaher in the past, why would detectives begin to suspect him? There was something else. Adrian Greenwood was not always Mr. Popular. There was a possibility that he had enemies.
By all accounts, he wasn't an easy man to get on with. He'd made a number of enemies, both in his personal and in his business life. There's a number of stories about him, the most interesting of which perhaps is that he once is meant to have held a washing machine installer hostage in his house for a number of hours because he wasn't satisfied that the door on the machine was working properly. Here we have somebody whose life and the way that they're perceived by other people might make you think that there were lots of people who had reason to do him harm or to do him down.
Solving the case of the murder of the Oxford bookworm may not be straightforward. By 4 o'clock on April 6, 2016, Adrian Greenwood's death had still not been reported. Michael Danaher had time to get away from the crime scene. He hoped his life could now be turned around. No more debts, some spare money to look after the family. Back in Peterborough, Michael Danaher has returned to the life that he was trying to escape. His was a lonely world. Binge eating. Binge drinking. But he had now taken action and was about to make more mistakes. It was time to cash in on his stolen booty.
He puts that book on eBay.
April 7th, 2016 was a day of showers with extended periods of spring sunshine in Oxford. As throngs of tourists, students and locals came and went and commuters headed to and from work, the body of Adrian Greenwood still lay behind closed doors in the hall of his house. That afternoon, it was discovered.
On the morning of the 7th of April, Mr. Greenwood's young cleaner comes in to clean the house as usual, and she's confronted with this horrific scene of her employer lying dead in the hall in a pool of blood. And she's just completely shocked by this and becomes hysterical, runs into the street, thereby raising the alarm. passers-by come to see what the commotion is, and one of them's a nurse from the local A&E, and she goes in to try and assist, but of course Adrian Greenwood is long dead.
In the city of fictional crime stories, a real-life murder mystery had begun.
The police arrive. They already know it's a murder scene. One of the first things they're going to be doing is photographing the scene in detail and taking a video to note the position of all the objects and the body. They're going to be taking close-up pictures of the body before they move anything. They're then going to be collecting evidence. So they'll be looking for signs of a struggle.
Police turn up at Adrian Greenwood's house and they start a full forensic examination. They discover that Adrian's phone, wallet and bank cards are missing.
Because Danaher had never committed crimes for which he had been convicted, there was no immediate match between DNA found at the scene and on the national database.
My appeal to the public today is twofold. First of all, anybody that knows Mr. Greenwood, has seen him recently or has had any contact with him, either professionally or personally, and hasn't spoken to the police to make contact with us. We will deal with all information that we receive sensitively. And secondly, you'll see a clip of CCTV on the screen. This CCTV was taken in Sainsbury's in Kidlington in the early evening of Tuesday, the 5th of April, just before 6 o'clock. That's the last sighting that we have of Mr. Greenwood.
Detectives discover that Mr. Greenwood has an occasionally prickly personality. They hear how he locked a delivery man inside his Iffley Road home when angered with the quality of a product. That the world of rare books in which Mr. Greenwood worked saw big money sales. The real reason for the murder soon emerges.
They start looking for a motive, I suppose, and to see if anything's been stolen and if it actually is a burglary or a robbery. And it becomes apparent that missing from Adrian Greenwood's house is a very rare 108-year-old first edition of The Wind in the Willows. And, you know, this is something which is of great value to collectors.
As investigators collect and collate evidence, no piece of factual data is too small.
It's important that we're able to build a picture of Mr. Greenwood and his lifestyle so that we can carry out the inquiries that we need to carry out in order to find out who's responsible for his death.
As they search the property, they discover that Mr. Greenwood's credit cards are missing, and something else.
It's also discovered that Adrian Greenwood's mobile phone has been stolen too. And not only has it been stolen, but it's not been switched off.
Would this prove to be the killer's mistake, the one which would point detectives in Danaher's direction?
So the phone's communicating with the network for a further 3 hours after he's murdered. And of course, every time it communicates to the network, it betrays its position and where it is.
Even though he's not using Greenwood's phone, that phone is continually signalling to the mobile phone masts that it passes, and police can track where that phone has been and where it ends up.
So the police were able to do cell site analysis. That means they can track that phone's movements.
And from that, pretty quickly, police were able to plot, well, Greenwood's phone has gone from Oxford to Peterborough. And that's a fantastic lead in their investigation because it suddenly narrows down the field of people who could have committed this crime to people who were travelling at that time between Oxford and Peterborough.
Michael Danaher, of course, lived in Peterborough, but at that stage of the inquiry, police knew only that someone had stolen Adrian Greenwood's phone, that he had probably also stolen a rare book, that whoever it was the key suspect in Mr. Greenwood's murder, that he had travelled from Oxford to Peterborough in the hours after the killing. They could still not know that that man was Michael Danaher. He was at home waiting for someone to buy his rare copy of Wind in the Willows on eBay. But the picture was coming together.
The business of not turning off the mobile phone you've stolen again tells us that Danaher was a bit of an amateur at this, really. I think it's pretty common knowledge that mobile phones, when switched on, can be tracked and can be traced.
This was the challenge facing detectives, to sift through security footage featuring multiple thousands of vehicles that had travelled from Oxford's Iffley Road on April 6, 2016, and then on to Peterborough.
From more than 5,000 that they started with, they're able, after a time, to narrow it down to just 20 vehicles. 20 vehicles that went from Oxford to Peterborough in the time frame we're looking at.
Until eventually they found just one car which had followed that same route as Greenwood's mobile phone. That car was a blue Citroën Picasso, and the number plate revealed that it belonged to Danaher.
The noose around his neck was tightening.
Danaher was oblivious. He was still hoping for a big sale of Wind in the Willows, to make a new start. Then came a knock on the door.
All this analysis, which sounds like a mountain of work, the Thames Valley Major Crime Team achieved in just 3 days. And so by the 10th of April, they have their suspect arrested. They've gone. 50-year-old Michael Danaher is arrested on suspicion of the murder of Adrian Greenwood.
It had been around 100 hours since Michael Danaher had committed just the second crime of his life. Was he about to pay for it by spending a life behind bars? As Oxford had woken to the news of a bloody murder in the shadow of its world-famous colleges, people living in the city may have expected that a lengthy police inquiry would be needed. In fact, just 4 days after the murder, the police had a man in their sights: Michael Danaher.
When he's arrested, Danaher vehemently denies the allegations. Nothing to do with me, don't know anything about it.
Once Danaher's become a murder suspect, police get a warrant and they go and look in his flat. They find several things which are really, really incriminating. For one thing, they find a pair of boots with blood still on them.
The first thing that police saw when they entered Danaher's home was that there were a pair of bloodied boots on the carpet, on the mat. He hadn't even washed them off, let alone get rid of them.
Those boots had the blood of Adrian Greenwood on them.
Danaher's mistakes are coming home to roost.
They find an absolute treasure trove of evidence.
A stun gun, which is disguised as an iPhone, is not the sort of thing that a law-abiding gentle giant may have in his house, you would think.
So not only did Danaher leave this massive digital footprint, he then kept hold of the book that he's stolen and left it sitting around in his flat.
That enabled them to search eBay records, and indeed, Danaher had already listed this first edition of Wind in the Willows on eBay, and they had that record of it.
Yet more evidence is discovered on Danaher's computer.
Once they start looking at what's on that laptop, they find this Excel spreadsheet hit list, which besides Adrian Greenwood's name and the expected take rare books and the modus any, they also find several wealthy celebrities' names, including Kate Moss and Simon Cowell.
He had a list, a hit list, of his intended targets on this madcap scheme he had to go and rob the wealthy to pay his debts off.
Detectives are looking for a match to the knife handle discovered at the crime scene. It doesn't take them long.
They find an envelope containing this broken knife blade, which has Adrian Greenwood's blood still on it.
And of course, that's then able to be physically matched back to the handle that was found at the scene in Adrian Greenwood's house where he was murdered. So the evidence now is mounting up. It's virtually game, set and match. It's such strong and such persuasive evidence.
There is more to come. The evidence that Danaher himself had sent from Iffley Road.
The selfie with the blood still on his face.
That photograph contains data which put Danaher at the scene of the crime, at the time of the crime, and Danaher actually had blood on his face when he took that photograph. It is stupidity beyond compare.
Danaher made a catalogue of errors in his crimes. He had the hit list at home that was easily findable, that showed the amount of premeditation there was. He used his own car. He was completely oblivious to closed-circuit television and automatic number plate recognition when he used that car for that journey.
The search of his flat unearthed amongst the detritus of Danaher's life the book that he thought would change everything.
They found the first edition Wind in the Willows book, the 108-year-old, £50,000 antique book that Danaher was willing to sell on eBay.
The catalogue of mistakes that Danaher had made seemed never-ending.
It's almost as if he was trying to be caught. You know, you couldn't really do much more other than phone the police as soon as you'd finish and say, come and get me. There was a lot of work in this case for the investigation team, and they did it very well and very swiftly. But I have to say, it wasn't difficult when someone's making all the errors like Michael Danaher was.
Which of the errors proved to be the turning point which led officers to Danaher's door? Rarely can a murder inquiry have been so led by one piece of compelling evidence to complete the picture of the suspected killer.
Danaher's really fatal mistake was taking Greenwood's phone, because that enabled police to track the journey that the phone travelled on and then narrow down the cars that had similarly travelled that route to pinpoint Danaher.
He kept Adrian Greenwood's mobile phone switched on for 3 hours.
That was like putting a tracker in your pocket. It put him from Greenwood's house back to his apartment. The evidence trail was substantial, it was watertight, it was irrefutable.
They'd never have got to him as a potential suspect if he hadn't have left his phone switched on so they knew to look in Peterborough.
The case against Michael Danaher was compelling, and given the number of mistakes made by the killer, it might be considered as an easy arrest. Not necessarily the case.
Even when you're confronted by a frankly quite dumb murderer like Michael Danaher, you have to get the evidence right. You cannot take your foot off the pedal or for a moment be complacent. As much evidence as you may have, you still have to present it properly, thoroughly to the court. You don't want them getting away.
But aside from the forensic and physical evidence, Danaher's own excuses were as weak as the thinking which went into the crime.
When he was asked to explain this hit list spreadsheet at court, Danaher said it was put on his computer by somebody else, a mystery man who he was unwilling to name. Of course, it was just such a ridiculous story that it wasn't believed by the jury, and he was duly convicted of murder. And the aggravating factors of the premeditation and the desire for financial gain from it meant that he was given a recommendation that he should serve 34 years before he was eligible to apply for parole. And not only that, he got another 7-year sentence for possessing the stun gun, because that technically is a firearm, and of course it's a firearm that's prohibited and a serious offence.
The sentences for murder and possession of a stun gun are to run concurrently. When Adrian Greenwood moved as a student to Oxford, he soon learned the value of scarcity. The economics scholar knew how supply and demand worked. If he could find something hard to come by which others wanted, he would benefit. Greenwood was a natural researcher, good at separating the commonplace from those books which would command a high price. He was oblivious to those who would seek a quick win. Men down on their luck, like Michael Danaher. A fantasist and inept killer who left a trail of evidence to prove the case against him, but who might have got away with his crime, but for the rookie mistake of stealing a phone from the scene of a murder and leaving it switched on as he drove all the way home. That was the killer's mistake, which led detectives to the door of Michael Danaher. It was a royal wedding weekend and Britain was enjoying a public holiday. At their home in the English Midlands, a Chinese family, the Dings, joined in the celebrations. They had made Britain their home.
They opened a Chinese medicine shop and they had 3 shops across the UK, and that was quite successful, and that represented that we're doing well financially and that they were quite proud of their businesses.
The Dings had set up a partnership with another Chinese family.
Anxiang and his wife came to this country from China in 1998. They were both doctors of traditional Chinese medicine, and they started a family, and after a short while they met the Dings. She was a businesswoman and he was a lecturer at university in Manchester.
But all was not what it seemed between the couples. The picture-perfect Ding family were about to be killed, one by one. The eldest daughter desperately phoning police for help as her assassin walked towards her.
It was the kind of thing that just makes your blood run cold in your veins. You know, it's that thing where you forget to breathe, where you are chilled throughout your whole body, and you just think, I'm witnessing somebody die a violent death. There's nothing to describe the horror when you know what those screams represent and what those poor children were going through.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Anxiang Du as guilty of murder? What would be a killer's mistake? The scene, which met officers as they arrived at the home of the Ding family in a quiet English village, was horrific.
My reaction was incredulity, because not so much in the sense that 2 adults had been murdered. I mean, sadly, you know, we all know that happens. I think the ferocity of the attack, the fact that it was a knife-related killing with multiple stab wounds, blood everywhere. But I think the thing that tipped it over the edge for me was the slaying of the 2 girls in the upstairs bedroom. To go and kill 2 defenceless girls cowering in their bedroom in their own home beggars belief.
Xing and Alice Ding, both talented violinists, quite literally knew what was coming. Their attacker had begun with their father.
He confronts Jeff Ding, produces his knife and attacks him. Jeff Ding tries to fight off the attack, to ward off the stab wounds, sustains defence wounds to his hands, and Jeff Ding dies of these stab wounds.
The attack was in the kitchen of the house. Jeff Ding's killer had only just begun.
It's believed that Helen Ding hears the commotion in the kitchen and she comes in, and Du immediately attacks her. She has no defence wounds, she hasn't had time to shield herself from the blows, but she's stabbed 13 times down the left side of her body. Fatal blows. He's killed them both, but he's not finished. He then turns his attention to their 2 daughters.
One 18, one just 12, and mercilessly and brutally in front of each other, stabbed them to death.
Before she died, the oldest Ding daughter managed to use her mobile phone to call the police.
It came to light that there was a telephone call that was made, horrifically enough, from one of the girls who had a mobile phone. So they tried to ring the police, and it went through on the 999 system. But it's what they call a dropped call. So when the emergency operator received the call, they just heard some screams on the end of the phone, and then the call dropped because it ended.
Events elsewhere had an influence on the possibilities of why the call had been made.
It was bank holiday afternoon, so I think there was an element that people thought it was some kind of prank or holiday high spirits. Nevertheless, the police were sent to the location that was indicated from mobile phone tracking that goes with a 999 call, but unfortunately, because of the nature of that tracking, the police were sent to the wrong location. So we know from that phone call, which was received at about just after 3:30 in the afternoon, that was when the murders were taking place, somewhere around the 3:30 mark. But the girls never got to make their request for assistance.
Phone tracking is not an exact science.
So it took the officers to a location at least a mile distant from where the actual murders had occurred. And of course, having turned up and there's nothing here and there doesn't appear to be any problem, would probably, add to this idea that, it's just a prank call. Sadly, the 999 service, fire, ambulance and police do get prank calls. This, chillingly, was not. This was a real call, and those were probably the last human sounds that those two poor girls made.
There can be little doubt that the Ding family will have screamed. But neighbours heard nothing. Their home overlooked a landscaped area free from other properties. It's probable that within minutes of Anxiang arriving at the house in Pioneer Close, all four had been killed.
The daughters were found upstairs in their bedrooms. One of the daughters was curled up in a ball. You get stabbed repeatedly, especially in the stomach. It's extremely painful, so maybe she was curled up in a ball because she was in so much pain and she then lost consciousness in that position. Another of the daughters was found in a prayer position.
With all four dead, the killer had completed what appeared to be a mission, wiping out an entire family.
What we now know that he did was that, having murdered the family in cold blood, he washed the murder weapon and knife and his hands and left it at the sink. I think the court records will say that he then felt some kind of physical reaction to having committed the murders and actually slept for a while at the house where the murders had been committed.
The slaying of the Ding family was over by 3:30 on the afternoon of Friday, April 29th. 42 hours would pass before their slaughter would be uncovered. Time enough for their killer to be a long way from the scene of their murder. Detectives know that most murders are carried out by someone who knows the victim well. Suspecting someone is, however, a far cry from having the evidence to prove a case. Seasoned investigators tend towards routine when trying to first find and then see a killer convicted. That routine generally starts with getting a phone call. The man who would lead the hunt for the killer of the Ding family is Glyn Timmins. He too was enjoying the royal wedding bank holiday when he heard of their death.
On the night of the 1st of May, when the murders came to light, my colleague was the on-call senior investigating officer for Northamptonshire, and he'd been sent to the discovery of bodies at a house in the Wootton area of Northamptonshire. And because they appeared to be the bodies of 4 family members within their family home, as the senior detective for Northamptonshire, I was put on alert to go and oversee the inquiry.
The family were murdered at their home on Friday, the 29th of April last year. The bodies weren't discovered till late Sunday afternoon, early Sunday evening, on the 1st of May.
One step at a time, evidence is gathered. Amongst the first pieces of the picture of a killer to emerge as Timmins and his team began their investigation, the time of death. Friday afternoon. Science provided that information.
When you die, after about 2 hours, between 2 and 4 hours, you get this kind of stiffening of the muscles. It starts off in the face and the neck and these little muscles, and then it spreads to these bigger muscles. And what's happening is a kind of chemical process in the muscle fibres where they're becoming cross-linked and stiff and rigid. That rigor mortis, that stiffness, will be maintained for about 2 days, after which the muscle fibres begin to disintegrate and then they become floppy again. So you can use the stiffness of different parts of the body to get some sort of estimation of how much time has elapsed.
Establishing time of death was a straightforward enough conclusion for pathologists. For detectives, a range of theories now had to be considered. One immediately occurred to the lead investigator.
Your first reaction is, well, you know, do we have a murder or do we have some kind of murder-suicide, which you know, does happen from time to time.
This, however, was not a case of murder-suicide. That was a theory soon dismissed. For it to be the case, the body of one of the 4 dead would offer no signs of having struggled.
I think we reached that conclusion fairly quickly because of the positions that the victims were found in, and it was clear that there had been a very violent struggle, and both the adult victims had been murdered as opposed to having a struggle between themselves. So it was clear fairly quickly that we were dealing with a third-party murderer.
What about the nationality and culture of the victims? Investigators would learn that revenge, always a possible motive in any murder inquiry, is one which has a long history in Chinese society, where loss of face has been known to lead to vendettas against whole families. Was that what was behind the killer's actions? Was he taking revenge on an entire family for having lost face over something?
In Chinese culture, there is a point where, oh yes, okay, I need to seek revenge in some way because he's done that to me, Ding has done that to me, therefore I need to sort of challenge that. I want him to lose face as well. He needs to do something about this family.
Sunday, May 1st, 2011 fell into 2 phases for the police. Before the discovery of the bodies, police in Northampton hear of an alert issued to all forces for a missing person, a Chinese national called Anxiang Du. Du was the co-owner of this herbal medicine business in Birmingham, and he had not been heard from since calling into the store on the public holiday 2 days earlier.
We went into the shopping centre and left in the appointments book there a note to his family in Mandarin Chinese, which said things like eternal blessings and were clearly kind of phrases that thought he was not going to see them again.
He left a message for his wife, basically telling her, goodbye, I'm going. What he didn't really realise was that his wife would then contact the police to report him missing.
It was on the Saturday, the 30th, she'd gone to the shop that they owned in Birmingham and found what appeared to be a suicide note. In actual fact, when you read the note, it read more as a goodbye note than potentially a suicide note. But as it was, that's how the note was interpreted. And as such, Anxiang Du was circulated by West Midlands Police quite rightly as a vulnerable missing person.
An alert goes to his local police force in the West Midlands saying this man has gone missing, he's in an agitated state, we're worried about him. That missing persons alert in the West Midlands will go centrally, so the police in Northampton who are coming across this slaughtered family will also have that information that a man, a Chinese national, has gone missing and is in an agitated state.
A trawl of people who might know Anxiang Du turned up the name of Jeff Ding.
It is quite common for the police to visit known associates of the missing person, and the Ding family were one of the few known associates of Anxiang Du.
So that Sunday morning of May 1st, an officer was sent to the Ding family home in an effort to find out if Mr. Du had been in touch with them.
The police were called that morning to visit the Ding family to see if they'd seen Du, and of course they knocked the door, got no reply early on a Sunday morning, nothing unusual in that. and left a calling card for them to contact the police. Obviously the officers, there is no way they could have known what was inside that quiet suburban house on a quiet, nice estate in a nice part of Northamptonshire.
Outside the house, no car. It was possible they were away. So, with their bodies inside, the officers attending the scene, oblivious to what had happened, left.
It is incredible, and I mean, you know, that there are occasions when this inquiry for me was marked more by extraordinary coincidences, missed opportunities, frustrations, barriers, than it was to, you know, normal detective work. I mean, it was literally a case of one step forward, two steps back.
Phase 2 of how police viewed events of May 1st, 2011 followed the eventual discovery of the bodies.
A neighbour of the Dings realises she hasn't seen the family about for a day, goes over and peers through the windows of their house and sees the carnage inside.
After the discovery of the bodies and the arrival of murder squad detectives on the case, it seemed too much of a coincidence. A Chinese family slaughtered on the day that a Chinese national who knew them is reported missing. The Dings had owned a Chinese herbal medicine business. Another Chinese national who owned a herbal medicine business was now officially a missing person. Why had the police in Birmingham assumed that the Dings would know anything about Anxiang Du? It turned out that Anxiang Du felt that he had plenty to be resentful about towards Jeff Ding. It wasn't always the case. The Ding and Du families went back a long time after the two women introduced their husbands to each other.
What we know is that Can Cheng Du and Ji Shui Ding became friends, and as they were becoming friends, their husbands, obviously, they met each other.
Initially they were friends and they went into business together to run a herbal medicine company.
And they in fact opened 3 of these shops, and things were looking good for them.
The then young professionals shared an expertise and worked hard.
And that was quite successful, and that represented that we're doing well financially and that they were quite proud of their businesses. That honour to them was quite what they represented. They can provide for their families, they can enjoy their lifestyle a bit more, because coming from mainland China, I'm sure they would have had quite hardships trying to find jobs, you know, trying to provide for themselves. So when they came over to Britain, this was an opportunity for success, you know, to be able to give their families the lifestyle that they probably didn't have when they were children.
However, disputes soon emerged between the business partners.
That relationship went sour when Anxiang Du was asked to leave the business by the Dings because of allegations of financial irregularity.
There were no charges, no police involvement, but it was the first hint that something was going wrong. And then 3 years later, in 2004, the Dus were dismissed from the partnership.
Things were to turn ugly. A complex dispute ended up in court.
Du and his wife started legal proceedings against the Dings on the basis they thought they'd been unfairly thrown out of their business partnership.
With the court procedures, at the start, they were quite in favour of the Dus, but as time progressed, the ruling was in favour of the Dings, and that meant for Du it was really spiralling out of control, and there was no hope really for him to go anywhere, to start a business, or, you know, just to find the financial means to support his family.
And at the end of that battle, it was the Dings and not the Dus that succeeded.
The feud which had developed between the two families caused Anxiang Du's bitterness to run deep. He now faced paying £88,000 in legal fees. A complex financial arrangement meant that the house the Dings were now living in was part of the business's assets. Du hoped to sell the house in the village of Wootton, Northamptonshire. It would help him pay off his legal costs. But Du did not actually own it. A court order was issued preventing Du from trying to sell the house.
effectively it froze the assets until the court made its determination, but effectively it meant that Mr. Du had no access to his financial assets and the sale of his house was prevented.
That order was issued the day before the murders. Detectives had their motive.
Who would want to kill these people? Why would they be killed like this? And because of the legal case and because of the bitterness and the rancour that was around the splitting up of their business, Du would be the obvious suspect.
I mean, clearly the delivery of the court restraining orders the night before had effectively pushed him over the edge in terms of anger, rage, the need to hit back. And I suspect that he spent most of that night thinking about it, ruminating about it, building it up in terms of bile, anger, the need for revenge and retribution. And by the time he went to work on that Friday morning, I'm as convinced as I can be that he had murder in mind, that was his objective.
In any culture, what had happened to Anxiang Du would cause deep resentment. Some commentators on Chinese culture suggest a violent reaction was all but inevitable.
On one side, you've got the financial difficulties because now he's trying to find another job.
Du had lost this court case. He was in a huge amount of debt.
But more importantly is the loss of face. Obviously, because it's all about pride and how one holds themselves in the Chinese culture. When something turns as sour as that, it's almost as if your whole world has turned upside down.
There was, to Anxiang Du, a lot to be angry about. 2 motive boxes were ticked.
There are a couple of things that come up in murder cases as common motives. One of them is, a big one, is revenge. So, he wanted revenge. It's something like 3% of homicide cases in this country have a financial motive. 40% of them, the motive is it's either an argument or a struggle or it's a revenge attack.
We very quickly were able to examine the background of the association between the Ding family and Anxiang Du and establish this court battle that had been ongoing. So very, very quickly we were able to pinpoint Du as the likely murder suspect.
Displaying a motive to kill so obviously had betrayed Du as the prime suspect. Police quickly put out appeals for information.
Extensive forensic examination of the scene took place late Sunday and into Monday, the 2nd of May, all day Monday the 2nd of May. This led to us naming Anxiang Du as the prime suspect in this case on Tuesday, the 3rd of May.
The court case which had so enraged Anxiang Du involved a third party, someone who had become involved in the business. Was he now at risk?
We didn't know where this murderer had gone, clearly wasn't still at the scene. And obviously your determination at the outset of any homicide inquiry is to bring the offender to justice, but this was clearly something completely out of the ordinary, if I can use such a term for homicide.
Where was Anxiang Du? What mistake had he made to lead police to him and to prove he was a killer? And would he kill again? Within hours of the discovery of the murdered Ding family, police begin a painstaking trawl through digital evidence. They needed to find him, but also to build a case, and they would uncover plenty of sightings.
The UK is one of the most highly watched places in the world. There's vast numbers of CCTV cameras which have been put up by the police, by local authorities, by private businesses, and increasingly private individuals are installing CCTV cameras. So there's estimated to be more than, I think, somewhere between 4 and 6 million CCTV cameras in the UK.
Police were able to watch step by step Du's activities before the slaughter at Pioneer Close. His mistakes began the moment that he left his home on the day of the murders.
He hadn't really thought through the possibilities as to how he might be caught because he didn't really take any precautions.
The timeline of movement for Anxiang began on the Friday at about 10 o'clock-ish. He drove to Coventry Railway Station.
From Coventry, he bought a ticket to get him to his shop in Birmingham. Cameras gathering information every second. He headed to his store, Natural Care in Birmingham.
It appears that he wasn't in the shop for very long, that he gathered a rucksack and wrote this goodbye note to his wife.
He picks up a bag which contains a knife.
It was the murder weapon.
And within a matter of minutes, left the shop, went to Birmingham New Street and started that fateful journey via train to Northampton, transferring at Northampton to the bus station.
Again, he was captured on camera. The journey from Birmingham to Northampton ended at 12:37. There, he soon found a bus that would take him to Wootton, the village where the Dings lived. On the bus, he appeared perfectly normal to other passengers, just someone else on a bus ride. During the journey, he changed seats. As he alighted, an issue to overcome. He was in the right village, but where was the house?
He doesn't know the area, he gets lost, he asks for directions to a driver, he's given directions but they're wrong as well. So there's quite a bit of toing and froing.
He would arrive at the house around 3 o'clock. The fate of the Ding family was sealed.
The last thing that he expects is his former business partner, is coming uninvited to his house, intent on revenge. But that's what happens. Anxiang comes into the kitchen.
Later, Anxiang would claim he was met with more provocation.
Ding laughed at Du and called him a fool. That is almost like public shaming. It is, one of the worst things that you can probably do in Chinese culture because you're shaming them in front of everyone.
He confronts Jeff Ding, produces his knife and attacks him.
Mrs. Ding seems to have been attacked just outside of the kitchen.
Du turns his attention onto her, again stabs her multiple times.
And then he ran upstairs to attack the daughters, who were cowering in a bedroom.
Anxiang went upstairs in that house, found 2 young girls cowering on a bed.
They're trying to summon help. But Du goes upstairs, finds them, and attacks them both. Stabs them both again, multiple times, again concentrating on the area of the body where he knows the vital organs are, intending to kill them. And he does. He kills both the girls. So within a matter of minutes, he's slain the entire family, mother, father, and both daughters.
The parents' bodies were found hidden behind a curtain downstairs, so they'd obviously been moved. The daughters were found upstairs in their bedrooms. One of the daughters was curled up in a ball.
Du's mind, previously entirely dominated by a lust to kill, now turned to covering his tracks.
Du's quite calm and collected.
Having murdered the family in cold blood, he washed the murder weapon and knife and his hands and left it at the sink.
Having first slept after the murders, Du now plots his escape.
What he found was Jeff Ding's wallet and car keys and decided, well, that's the means by which I'm going to make my escape.
The Ding car, one they had hired, was conspicuous by its absence when a police officer had visited. It was not there because Anxiang had taken it. It seems likely he waited until dark and left Pioneer Close sometime after 8:30 on April 29th. He then headed for a motorway.
The last sighting was at junction 8A of the M40, which is some miles distant of London, so he could have gone pretty much anywhere on that motorway. We were reliant on finding the stolen Vauxhall Corsa.
Du's escape was haphazard but successful. He heads south and gets lucky as he drives into London by using a route where there were no cameras capable of automatic number plate recognition. He went undetected, for now.
The car was abandoned in a side street, this Venables street, and we've got grainy CCTV at about 2:30 in the morning of someone matching Anxiang Du's description, walking along and looking into a shop front as he leaves the car behind.
The illegally parked car gets ticketed again and again and again over 9 days. Du once again got lucky. There is a nationwide hunt for him and for the car that he was driving, but none of the traffic wardens called the vehicle in to be towed away. If they had, it would have alerted police to its whereabouts and given them hope of finding Du.
Incredibly, perhaps, the car is parked in London and tracks 9 parking tickets, but nobody manages to connect the fact that this car is the one that was being used by the wanted man.
This case highlights a flaw in the system. You'd expect that if a car has been parked on a stretch of road and amassed 9 parking tickets over a series of days, that might flag up something to the local authority, that there may be a problem with this car, maybe it's been stolen and abandoned, maybe something has happened to the owner, because otherwise how come they haven't come back and moved their car to stop them getting more parking tickets? That red flag wasn't raised, and maybe if it had, they might have got more information sooner.
The apparent abandon shown by Anxiang Du meant that the police were getting reports from people who'd seen him on public transport.
We have had over 380 suspect sightings. The majority of those sightings have been in the UK, and all of those sightings are dealt with under a very strict process to make sure we get the optimum from those sightings.
In fact, Anxiang Du had got lucky for a 3rd time. He boards a ferry for France and is again not spotted.
So he makes that journey across to France, he makes his way down through France, into Spain, and eventually gets the ferry from Algeciras across to Tangiers.
Anxiang Du goes off grid in Morocco. He's living there under a false name, getting what work he can.
His luck just keeps on coming.
Once he's in Morocco, Du's actually arrested. He's arrested on suspicion of being there illegally. And he's released. This is only 5 days after the murders. But he's released because he claims his name is Li Ming, that he's from Taiwan, and he's allowed to stay. And he goes on to get a job. He ends up working as a night watchman on a construction site, and he had nowhere to live. He was sleeping sort of rough in the construction site, and some of the other workers kind of took pity on him and would give him food and so forth because they thought his life was so poor. But he was still free. He'd managed to escape.
Du had made a series of mistakes as he had set off to murder his victims. The trail of evidence from his front door to the house where he had killed, together with the clear motive that he had, was likely to get police a conviction. But within weeks of the murders, he was 2,000 miles away, living almost rough, with a new name, a new job, a new life. Police, meanwhile, were ramping up their appeals for help.
The Ding family had been in the UK since about late 1990. Jeff was working at Manchester University as a lecturer. Helen working locally at a school in Northampton, and with the children involved in education in Northampton as well. Since around 2002, both Jeff and Helen had been involved in a civil dispute with the Chinese family over a business issue.
They knew who they were looking for and why he had killed. What would be the mistake to ensure that the police would catch a killer? Detecting who had killed the Ding family had not taken long. Anxiang Du had hardly tried to cover his tracks.
I think by then, my personal opinion is that he set his mind on a course of action, and he was blind to everything else.
In the months which followed the murders, police knew they would need all the help they could get, and they travelled far and wide.
Our visit to China had three specific aims. These were to brief the Ministry of Public Security, which are essentially the Chinese police in Beijing, and inform them of the inquiry, the work we've undertaken today, and also to seek their assistance for further inquiries.
Unbeknownst to police, Du's haphazard escape plan had worked. But he was not in China, he was in North Africa, free but facing the indignity of sleeping on a construction site, living on handouts.
I think Du would have found that humiliating, you know, on a makeshift bed and having food parcels, because he's so used to having his business, being able to provide for his family, and his lifestyle has drastically changed, you know, being able to provide for his family, having the means to go out and socialise with people, and for him to be isolated in Morocco, for him to have almost the food parcels given to him and sleeping on the makeshift bed, that's such a different lifestyle for Du that he's just not used to.
He cut an unmistakable figure, and it was this which was to be his undoing. His image had been captured by cameras throughout the English Midlands. It had taken time, but his getaway car had been found in London. It was hard to miss the face of Anxiang Du.
Anxiang Du becomes the most wanted person on the Crime Stoppers website. He's, you know, it's imperative for the police to find him as soon as possible. This is a man who's killed 4 people already, and there's a danger there. He circulates internationally because it's feared that he might have gone abroad.
I have to accept that Anxiang Du may have left the UK. We still look for him within the UK, but he may have left the UK possibly soon after the murders. Someone must have assisted him and is likely to be still assisting him or aware of where he is. I emphasise we've now increased the reward to £25,000, which is a substantial award, and we're looking for that information to come to us directly as the investigation team or through Crime Stoppers.
And that was how Du would be caught. As sightings stopped, it became clear that he'd got out of Britain. His profile, so easy to publicise using the images captured on surveillance, made for headline news and international Crime Stopper programmes.
I should also stress that today we've had no confirmed sightings of Anxiang Du anywhere in the world. This is one reason why I've fully utilised the Crime Stoppers structure, for example, throughout the UK, Europe and lately North America, to highlight to as wide an audience as possible.
The availability of Du's image made it easier to spread the word.
What he doesn't realise is that Spanish TV has a programme quite similar to Crime Watch in the UK, and they cover the case, and his photo is put onto Spanish TV, and then someone recognises him in Morocco.
In July 2012, so some 14 months after the murders, the man who runs the building site and employs him as night watchman realises that his night watchman is actually Anxiang Du, the wanted quadruple murderer from the UK. He tells the police. Du is arrested in Morocco when he is finally brought back to the UK and charged with the murder of the 4 members of the Ding family.
Killers who are captured have always made at least one mistake. Du was first reported to police by his own wife, anxious at seeing a note showing Du in despair. Was that his biggest mistake?
The letter was obviously the precursor to Anxiang Du being treated as what we call a vulnerable missing person. What that did was elevate his status as a missing person to one of a high priority. So the very fact that he was identified as potentially being vulnerable through what appeared to be a suicide threat meant that the police would make immediate active inquiries to trace his whereabouts. And it was those immediate active inquiries to trace his whereabouts that provided the vital link between our murders and the missing person inquiry.
Or was the killer's mistake the trail that he left, which made it easy for detectives to know who the killer was?
I think Du's biggest mistake was not realising the extent of surveillance in this country. Once you become a person of interest, The police can then go back and look at the CCTV footage, and they can find images of you everywhere. There were images of him travelling by train. There were images of him on a bus towards the victim's house. Then once he steals their car, there's the automatic number plate recognition cameras that are picking up where that vehicle is travelling.
Virtually everything he did on the day of the murders and the day after were recorded, and police were able to go back to and piece together his entire route.
Once you become a person of interest, you are watched and there are photos of you everywhere, and it was really those photos and those images which helped convict him.
For lead detective Glyn Timmins, the context of Anxiang Du's murders make him amongst the worst killers that he has come across.
When you talk about evil, you talk about pre-planning, you talk about those elements that somebody has deigned that you were going to die. I don't think it was evil from that point of view, because this was blind rage.
Why had he done it? His argument had been with Jeff Ding and his wife. But surely not the children.
You might wonder why Du killed the whole of the Ding's family and not just Ding himself.
What was more important to him was getting the revenge that he felt was due for the wrong that had been done to him and to his family.
It's really because the way that the Chinese culture works. We talked about losing face in the family name, and for Du, Ding has taken everything away from him. Therefore, Du not only has to kill Ding, but he has to kill everyone associated with the Ding name. So that includes his wife and the 2 children.
Not something a hard-nosed detective finds easy to take.
Nothing will ever reconcile me to the mentality of somebody who goes up to a child's bedroom, finds 2 innocent young people cowering on a bed, having slain their parents. They're in terror, and then that person goes setting about them with a knife, stabbing them repeatedly in front of each other to take their lives. That is malevolent, that is evil. There is no way that I can ever come to terms with that. It just defies every belief I hold dear. It's inconceivable.
In 2013, Anxiang Du argued in court that he was guilty only of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He had lost control. His defence was rejected by a jury, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years behind bars. He will be 94 when he is eligible for release.